The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the organic wine company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to thomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Thom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Settlers, the Mythology of the White Proletariat, the True Story of the White Nation by J. Sakai, published by Morningstar Press in 1989. This is from Chapter 2, The Foundations of Settler Life. The life of European settlers and the class structure of their society was abnormal because it was dependent upon a foundation of conquest, genocide, and enslavement. The myth of the self-sufficient white settler family clearing the wilderness and supporting themselves through their own initiative and hard labor is a propaganda fabrication. It is the absolute characteristic of settler society to be parasitic, dependent upon the super-exploitation of oppressed peoples for its style of life. Never has Euro-American society completely supported itself. This is the decisive factor in the consciousness of all classes and strata of white society from 1600 to now. Settler society was raised up above the level of backward old Europe by a foundation of conquest. This conquest was a miracle drug for a Europe convulsed with the reaction of decaying feudalism and deadly capitalism. Shot into the veins of the Spanish feudal nation, for instance, the miracle drug of the New World conquest gave Spain the momentary power to overrun North Africa, Holland, and Italy before her historical incident waned. Like many such fixes for Euro-Americans, this conquest was addicting. It was habit-forming and rapidly indispensable, not only culturally, but in the mechanism of an oppressor society whose lifeblood was new conquest. We'll examine this later in the relationship of settlerism to imperialism. For now, it's enough to see that this conquest is a material act of great magnitude, an economic and social event as important as the emergence of the factory system or the exploitation of petroleum in the Middle East. We stress the obvious here because the Euro-American settlers have always made light of their invasion and occupation, although the conquered territory is the precondition for their whole society. Traditionally, European settler societies throw off the propaganda smoke screens that they didn't really conquer and dispossess other nations. They claim with false modesty that they merely moved into vacant territory. So the early English settlers depicted America as empty, a howling wilderness, unsettled, sparsely populated, just waiting with a vacant sign on the door for the first lucky civilization to walk in and claim it. Theodore Roosevelt wrote defensively in 1900, quote, "The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages," end of quote. It is telling that this lie is precisely the same lie put forward by white Afrikaner settlers who claim that South Africa was literally totally uninhabited by any Africans when they arrived from Europe. To universal derision, these European settlers claim to be the only rightful historic inhabitants of South Africa. Or we can hear similar defenses put forward by the European settlers of Israel, who claim that much of the Palestinian land and buildings they occupy are rightfully theirs, since the Arabs had allegedly decided to voluntarily abandon it all during the 1948-49 war. Are these kinds of tales any less preposterous than those put forward by Euro-American settlers? America was spacious and sparsely populated only because the European invaders destroyed whole civilizations and killed off millions of Native Americans to get the land and profits they wanted. We all know that when the English arrived at Virginia, for example, they encountered an urban, village-dwelling society far more skilled than they were in the arts of medicine, agriculture, fishing, and government. This civilization was reflected in a chain of 300 Indian nations and peoples stretching from the Arctic Circle to the tip of South America. many of whom had highly developed societies. There was, in fact, a greater population in these Indian nations in 1492 than in all of Western Europe. Recent scholarly estimates indicate that at the time of Columbus, there were 100 million Indians in the hemisphere, 10 million in North America, 25 million in Central Mexico, and an additional 65 million elsewhere in Central and South America. These numbers have long been concealed since they give rise to the logical question of what happened to this great mass of people. The European invaders, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, and French, simply killed off millions and millions to safeguard their conquest of the land and provide the disposable slave labor they needed to launch their new world. Conservative Western historical estimates show that the Spanish reduced, in quotes, the Indian population of their colonies from some 50 million to only 4 million by the end of the 17th century. And from the 10 million Indians who once inhabited North America, after 4 centuries of settler invasion and rule, there were in 1900 perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 surviving descendants in the United States. This was the very substantial down payment towards the continuing blood price that third world nations have to pay to sustain the Euro-American way of life. So when we hear that the settlers pushed out the Indians or forced the Indians to leave their traditional hunting grounds, we know that these are just code phrases to refer politely to the most barbaric genocide imaginable. It could well be the greatest crime in all of human history. Only here, the Adolf Eichmanns and Heinrich Himmlers had names like Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Jackson. The point is that genocide was not an accident, not an excess, not the unintended side effect of virile European growth. Genocide was the necessary and deliberate act of the capitalists and their settler shock troops. The book Settlers.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. We are broadcasting, as you can probably tell by the audio, a little bit of an echo here, that we are broadcasting live from the Mass Torts Made Perfect Conference at the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. And this is Mike Papantonio's big twice-a-year hoop-de-doop for lawyers and progressives, frankly. A big cocktail party last night. Louise and I had a really nice dinner last night with David Pakman and Sam Cedar and Scott Milliken, and it was fascinating. And we're here, today, tomorrow, and we're flying home on Saturday. So we'll be doing our show live here today and tomorrow. So some of the stuff, that's going on, there's a lot going on in the news today that I want to talk about, and I'm also curious your thoughts on all these various things. We've got Pompeo, we've got Hespel, we've got, there's a long list, but I want to start out by telling you the apparently bizarre stuff that happens when you go on Fox News. You'll recall a couple of weeks ago, I was invited to go on Fox News and debate some conservative about something. Frankly, I don't remember the topic even. I mean, this is how pablum-ish it all was and is. But my comment was about the Trump crime family. And when I dropped that phrase, Trump crime family, and I actually think that we are being ruled right now by the Trump crime family, and that includes Ivanka and Jared and Donald and Don Jr. and Eric's wife, who's running all the media operations for Trump's campaign and promoting Trump and running a little television network on the internet about Trump, if you hadn't noticed. Eric might not be the smart one, but it looks like his wife is. And so, whether it's Uday Kuse, Trump, or whether it's, Ivanka and Jared, they have all been up to their eyeballs in things that seem so sleazy and so shady that I feel comfortable referring to them as the Trump crime family. So when I said that on Fox News, both the conservative I was debating and the commentator said, "Whoa, Trump crime family." It just, I'm sure you can see the clip online. And I thought, well, that's interesting. We'll see where that goes. Well, apparently it went right into the head of Sean Hannity. This is a story from the Washington Post. And the headline in the Washington Post today, Trump touts Hannity's show on deep state crime families led by Mueller, Comey, and Clinton's. And Trump tweeted, big show tonight on @Sean Hannity, promoting Hannity's 9 p.m. segment on Fox News. I'm wondering, by the way, is this a violation of the Hatch Act? He's sitting in the White House and he's promoting a commercial television network and a multimillionaire commercial television star? Anyhow, that was his tweet. And by early Thursday morning, Hannity was the #1 topic trending on Twitter. But here's what Hannity said. Again, quoting from the Washington Post piece, in a conspiratorial, long-winded monologue, Hannity charted connections he sees among Mueller, Comey, and Hillary Clinton. The pundit outlined what he described as, quote, obvious deep state crime families trying to take down the president. And the Washington Post adds, consisting of the Clinton family, the Comey family, and the Mueller family. Right. You know, Clinton family, yeah, okay, Hillary and her husband, at least there's a family there, but, crime, really? Comey? I mean, what does his wife have to do with this? His kids, the Mueller family? What does his wife and kids? Hannity is, taking my phrase, trying to turn it around, and really stretching this thing. I mean, really stretching this thing. It's twisted into a pretzel. Lamar Waldron and I wrote a piece for Alternet that is up over at alternet.org right now that I refer you to. I think you'll find it fascinating. The headline is Donald Trump and Paul Manafort revived Nixon's race-based hate strategy for the 21st century. The subhead, just as conservative politicians easily use racism to generate votes, power, and money, the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. was also the result of racism for profit and political gain. And I think in some ways, if I was rewriting this thing, I buried the lead. The big news about this is how Paul Manafort was the guy. He was Reagan's Southern strategy guy. Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort started a consulting company. First, he worked for the Jerry Ford campaign. That was kind of his start in Republican politics. Wrangling delegates on the floor of the Republican convention in 1976. And then after working for the Jerry Ford campaign, in 1980, he went to work. He started a political consulting firm, and then he went to work for Ronald Reagan. And he was in charge of Reagan's Southern strategy, his Southern tier of states strategy. And so as the guy who was in charge of Reagan's Southern strategy, he took Nixon's old Southern strategy, which is reach out to white racists and use coded language to speak to them. So you have to use coded language so you don't turn off and upset the moderates, but use this coded language and bring these racists into the Republican Party. And so the first speech that Ronald Reagan gave in 1980, that Paul Manafort set up, the first speech that Reagan gave in 1980 was at the Neshoba County Fair, just a few miles from Philadelphia, Mississippi, the scene of the murder of Schwermer, Goodman, and Cheney, the 3 civil rights workers who were brutally murdered by police and a group of white racists down there at the time. And I mean, and what did Reagan say? He said, I believe in states' rights. He didn't say, here we are on the hallowed ground of murdered civil rights leaders. It's time to talk about, expanding Brown versus Board of Education. No, nothing like that at all. And in fact, this continues. Right now, David Vitter, remember David Vitter, the Republican from Louisiana, the Republican senator from Louisiana who got caught with a hooker. And his wife showed up in the leopard skin suit to, when he was doing his I'm so sorry thing. And then he ran for re-election, got re-elected. Well, his wife's a lawyer. And Trump has appointed her for a federal judgeship. And when Senator Richard Blumenthal, who is on the committee that vets this, said, do you believe that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided? Brown versus Board was the 1954 Supreme Court decision that said schools could not be segregated any longer. So if she says no, she's in favor of segregation. And she said, Senator, I don't mean to be coy, but I think I can get into a difficult area when I start commenting on Supreme Court decisions which are correctly decided and which I may disagree with. I would respectfully not comment on what would be my boss ruling, her ruling on this. She's going to be the federal judge that will cover the Eastern District of Louisiana, which includes New Orleans, a city whose population is 60% African American. Great story about this over at rawstory.com. And so, it continues, right? Wendy Vitter is not only this, I mean, she's also so anti-abortion that she has said that, and promoted the idea that a brochure should be passed out in medical offices saying that women who get abortions are more likely to suffer a violent death because they're attracted to men who have the DNA that does that, right? Which gets, the whole DNA thing gets us back to Trump's I got the best DNA race stuff too.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's just altogether bizarre. I don't know how to describe it other than that. We'll pick up your calls throughout the show today. Give us a shout. And welcome back. Dion in Round Lake, Illinois. Hey, Dion, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom, I heard you talk about the subprime mortgage crisis yesterday again, and I believe the next one is probably the student loan crisis. I think we'll see a huge drop in enrollment under this administration. Is it a tax plan that's going to affect Pell Grants and financial aid?
The tax plan, Pell Grants, and financial aid. How are you connecting those three?
I think it was a Trump's tax plan that was going to affect the financial aid and Pell Grants. I think I heard it before on with Wolf and on RT before.
Yeah,
they did a special about economic collapse.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. I don't know the details on that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There's so much in that tax plan that we're just now discovering, Dion. It's just incredible.
Well, how do you think a collapse of the college bubble will look like?
Well, you've got $1.2 or $1.4 trillion in college debt, and it would take a substantial number of people to default on it. But and because of the Bankruptcy Act of 2005, Joe Biden's Bankruptcy Act of 2005, Joe Biden and Debbie Stabenow's Bankruptcy Act of 2005. It is illegal to discharge student loans via bankruptcy. So anybody who wants to get rid of their student loans by declaring bankruptcy, which would be the second step, first you just stop paying them, won't have that option. There's no legal way to do that. So then the question becomes, are enough people willing to destroy their credit, possibly for the rest of their lives these days? It used to be only 7 years, and then your records were wiped clean. Now it's the rest of your life. Are enough people willing to do that, that they will basically take down the student loan business? And I suspect the answer to that is no, just because it would take large, uncoordinated efforts. The reason people bailed out of their home mortgages was because, a home mortgage, a home is something that you can literally walk away from. The bank will repossess it, sell it, and then reduce your debt by the amount of the sale. So there's a rational upside to a consumer, to a person, to a citizen who has a crappy mortgage, one of these 5-year exploding mortgages or whatever it may be. There's a rational upside to walking away from those. The rational upside to walking away from a student loan, I don't see, Dion, other than a protest statement or just an inability to pay. What do you think?
Well, I think this is going to be the worst generation with people with credit. I think it's going to, for consumers, it's going to be a trend in renting homes and renting cars.
Yeah. We're looking at the enslavement, essentially, by the capitalist overclass of an entire generation. And that really a couple of generations, X, Y, and Z. You know, the three generations that have come along since, not just since 2005, I'd say basically since the late 80s. I mean, Reagan started this process of deconstructing free college education in the United States. Him and Bill Bennett as education secretary. It's been very successful from a Paul Ryan Republican point of view. But I don't see how that turns into a national movement. I can understand very easily how it does with mortgages. I don't see it with student loans, but I could be wrong. Dion, thanks for the call and thanks for watching us on YouTube. We'll be right back. We're live from Las Vegas. We're, by the way, broadcasting live today from Las Vegas from the Mass Torts Made Perfect conference, Mike Papatonio's conference here. And first, you know, this whole thing about Paul Manafort and Donald Trump, I think that that's, you know, a really big deal. But secondly, Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan is leaving office right now. Now, my question for you is, what do you think Paul Ryan's legacy is going to be? You know, 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now, as we're looking back and saying, okay, this guy was Speaker of the House, number 3 in line for the presidency, arguably one of the most powerful positions in the United States, period, bar none. That was Paul Ryan, or is right now even. And he pushes through a $5 trillion tax cut that requires the federal government to borrow immediately, starting October 1st, $1.5 trillion in order to give that money to billionaires. And now we're finding, the Congressional Budget Office just came out and said, this is going to take the national debt up to $30 trillion. $30 trillion is a mind-boggling amount of money. I mean, a genuinely mind-boggling amount of money. And if this happens, you know, I've been saying for a long time the debt in and of itself is not so much a problem, right? Because the federal debt is private savings, and that's a reality. The federal debt is private savings. And in other words, people buy treasury bonds as a way to save money. And this, of course, is why the billionaires on Wall Street, you know, people like the late Pete Peterson, were so bent out of shape saying we've got to do away with the federal debt, because they didn't like the fact that the federal government was essentially competing with the Wall Street banks. And the Wall Street banks are like, you know, hey, you've got you know, 10, 12, might be as much as $13 trillion now of actual debt. I mean, there's $3 or $4 trillion that the government owes to itself that's part of the national debt. But you know, the banksters on Wall Street are saying, hey, you know, you've got all this debt, and we would like to be providing that debt. We'd like to be the ones who are selling the debt to you. And there's an enormous amount of profit to be made on sitting on $10 trillion worth of loans, on making the interest from them. And in fact, our federal government is paying that interest, you know, to people who buy the Treasury bills, the bonds and the bills, the Treasury bills. And instead of having, you know, people be paying interest, or having the federal government be paying interest to individual people, those people would have, you know, or let's flip this around. Instead of people having their savings placed with the federal government, which is what happens when you buy debt instruments, when you buy treasury bills. Instead, you know, Wells Fargo says, we want people to borrow their money from us. So back to Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan has absolutely done this for these guys, for the banksters, and you know, I mean, he's jacking the debt up to the point where the two Santa Claus theory kicks in, and it kicks in a big way, where even the average citizen is saying, whoa, that's a lot of debt. And maybe we shouldn't have all that much debt. Maybe the federal government, you know, shouldn't be operating like this. And of course, when you get a consensus for that, and this is part 2 of the two Santa Claus theory, and this is part 2 of what these guys are all about. When you get a consensus about that, where, you know, a broad cross-section of the American people say, yeah, the federal debt is out of control. At that point, then demagogues like Paul Ryan and Donald Trump can come in and say, well, you know, we're spending $700 billion a year on welfare right now. And, you know, we're spending $1 trillion on Medicare and Medicaid. So let's just do away with these programs. We don't need no stinking social safety net. And, you know, to hell with the poor people and the working poor. We don't need any of that. So this is what these guys are up to in a very, very bizarre way. Another question I'm curious your thoughts on. This from the Associated Press. 8 months before the company that owns the National Enquirer paid $150,000 to former Playmate, that would be to a former Playboy Playmate who claimed, that was Karen McDougal, who claimed she had an affair with Donald Trump. The tabloid's parent made a $30,000 payment to a less famous individual, a former doorman at one of Donald Trump's New York City buildings. As he did with the ex-Playmate, the Enquirer signed the ex-doorman to a contract that effectively prevented him from going public. What does he want to go public about? That American Media Inc. paid this guy, his name is Sajudin, $30,000 for in perpetuity? Apparently, that he knows that Donald Trump fathered an illegitimate child with an employee at Trump World Tower, which is a skyscraper he owns near the UN. Boy, Donald gets around, doesn't he? And this was just a couple of years ago. So in 2015, as Donald was deciding to run for president. So, you know, when you're a billionaire, you can pay people off. When you're president of the United States, it becomes a lot more problematic. Is this an issue for you?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I mean, to what extent does Trump's morality reflect on the United States? To what extent are we a laughingstock of the world with this guy as our president?
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from the Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness,
and will, despite all, remain broken because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten thinks Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Schukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met, who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around, and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Well, the award for the funniest the post of the week it goes to Democratic Underground's Kay Pete, who says, if you think your week sucks, a bunch of kids are about to find out that Donald Trump is their real dad on the news. About to find out on the news. Can you imagine discovering that your real dad is Donald Trump? And oh my God. So anyhow, I'm declaring this an anything goes day today and tomorrow. You don't have to be on topic. If there's anything that you want to get into or talk about here on the program, feel free. But there are still a few other things that I want to get through. Mike Pompeo is, Pompeo was he's right now being grilled by the Senate. Well, not grilled. He's being gently patted by the Senate. After talking about his wife and kids and all, it's I'm just a friendly teddy bear here. To be the head of the CIA, to be the Secretary of State. He is the head of the CIA right now. And Gina Haspel, the woman who ran the torture operations in Thailand for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney during the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, she's going to be before the Senate shortly for confirmation for the CIA. And Pompeo was a reliable kind of cokehead, right-wing Tea Party type for years and years in the U.S. House of Representatives, which is where Trump seems to be going to get his people. I mean, if they had been supported by the Koch network for years, and they called themselves Tea Partiers, then Donald Trump was down with it. They were just fine with Donald Trump. And I don't frankly know if Mike Pompeo has the qualifications or the temperament to run the CIA, to run the State Department, to be our Secretary of State. My sense of it is no, but it's also possible that the guy was a political opportunist his whole entire life, that he was basically just, saying and doing whatever he had to say and do in order to get by, essentially, politically. And what you have to do if you're a Republican these days is suck up to the billionaires and suck up to Trump and mouth talking points that are BS, like there's no such thing as global warming, et cetera. And if Pompeo's been doing that just because that's what you have to do to get wealth and power, and now as Secretary of State, he's a decent and smart guy who's actually going to run the State Department well, I'd be surprised, but not horrified. But my sense of it is that these guys who come up through the ranks in the Tea Party are not qualified to be Secretary of State, just real simply. And that Pompeo should not be Secretary of State. And Gina Haspel, somebody who ran torture operations or participated or supervised or had any role at all in torture operations in Thailand, really should not be there either. Helen in Rochester, New York. Hey, Helen, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Today I was reading online on Newsweek about China siding with Russia against the U.S. Attacking Syria, and I saw something come up on CNN that Trump is going to be making a decision soon about Syria, and I was just wondering if you think this is something we should be concerned about, that he's really going to attack Russia and Syria when he has China and Russia together against him.
Trump is walking a very, very fine line, and somebody sat him down and told him this. The other day he said, heads up, Russia, here come the missiles, or words to that effect in a tweet. That was the day before yesterday. And now today he's tweeting, well, maybe we'll hit Syria and maybe we won't. Because somebody said, remember when you used to criticize Obama for telegraphing his military moves? That's what you just did, you bozo! So, he's figuring that out. But the real danger here, if Trump throws some missiles into Syria, is that he might hit some Russian troops. There are Russia has a long relationship with Syria, just like we have a long relationship with Qatar. We have an entire fleet based in Qatar, and we have both an air and a sea operation operating out of Qatar, another country just down the road from Syria. And Russia has been doing the same thing with Syria for years and years. In fact, Syria is where their deep water fleet is located. And so Syria is a strategic ally for Russia. Whether they like or hate Bashar al-Assad almost doesn't matter. They need that country to be stable in order to maintain their military presence in the region. And so, they've been propping up his particular government. I think, if the war were to die down and everybody were to go away, they would figure out a way to probably replace him, although, who knows. But because they need a stable government in Syria in order to have their military fleet in that area, they have advisors scattered throughout the Syrian government. And so if we take out a military, place, if we take out an air base, if we take out a missile site, whatever it may be, there's a very real chance that we'll kill Russian soldiers or Russian diplomats or Russian technicians. And if that happens, then Russia may say, okay, guys, you just declared World War III. And, we're going to nuke New York next. I mean, somebody needs to sit Trump down and say, this is the real danger. And, Russian commentators were talking about this overnight, and it's in the news today. You can read about it in the Washington Post, the New York Times. And, this is insanely dangerous. So that's my concern, Helen. Helen, I'm move along, but thank you for the call, and thanks for bringing up. And the second thing that Helen brought up was China. And if China says we're with Russia on this, then we really are going down the same road we went down in World War I, where you really, you go to war essentially with one country, and suddenly you find yourself at war with a dozen. Irene in New York City. Hey, Irene, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. Hartmann. So nice to talk to you. Yes, I would just like to bring up the topic of Paul Ryan's departure. I think much too late departure. And I mentioned to your screener, I am a huge fan of Dr. Krugman's at the Times and other places, that he, that Ryan is a
Paul
sham.
And Ryan was there to get a tax cut for the Koch family and their business and their other billionaire buddies. I mean, that's why they have supported him all these years. It certainly seems. And he did that. He got the billionaire class a tax cut, and now he's saying, and now I can go home.
Well, apparently. I mean, he looks like he's dragging his tail a little bit. Maybe he didn't get as far as he had hoped he would get. I mean, he's still young-ish. But I
maybe he
really know. I mean, he put together, he was the wunderkind. Put together, these little pamphlets with nothing but little asterisk placeholders where there were no numbers. Where his budget plan.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
anyway,
he's a BS artist. He's a con man, is what he is. Now, the question in my mind was, for years, do these guys actually believe that if you cut taxes, it increases economic activity? Because there's no evidence of that, right? Unless you cut taxes on working people. We know from George Bush's tax cut, when Bernie Sanders essentially blackmailed him, forced him, shamed him into giving every American $300. So we all got this $300 check. And there was an instant increase in economic activity as a result of that, because when 150 million people get $300, that's a substantial amount of money, and that goes immediately into the economy, into purchases. Now, the upside of that was it created an immediate stimulus. The downside was that the stimulus only lasted 6 months. Now, conventional economic theory would suggest that that stimulus should last for a long, long time, right? You get your $300, you go out to a fancy dinner. Now the restaurant has that $300. The waiters have some of that $300. The staff have some of that $300. They go out and buy things in the community. They buy a local widget, and then the widget maker now has the $300, and it just kind of circulates through the economy. The problem is that when Nixon opened us to China and when Reagan began this so-called free trade neoliberalism, now as soon as you buy something made in China, that $300 goes to China, and it no longer circulates in the U.S. economy. So as soon as you buy something, and not just China obviously, but any other foreign country, and so the ability to stimulate the economy by giving money to consumers has
pretty much been wasted by 30 years of neoliberal trade policy. And so you can't even stimulate the economy anymore in a lasting way, in a way that lasts more than a year or so, by putting money in the pockets of working people unless it's on a long-term basis. Now, you can stimulate the economy by giving them a raise in the minimum wage so that they're continuously getting stimulus. But as long as much of the money that goes into our economy ends up in other countries, it's not going to have that stimulative effect. So the question in my mind is, did Paul Ryan understand that? Because this is just kind of basic econ. This is Econ 101. And did he really understand that? And therefore, he was just lying to us all this time just to get the tax cuts for the billionaire class so that he could make sure that his nest is feathered, so that, you know, at the age of 51, he can retire. I think he's 51. He can retire now, and, you know, he'll get a cushy multi-million-dollar job courtesy of some billionaire someplace. Or did he actually still believe this BS that was promoted by Reagan of you know, trickle-down economics and supply-side economics? And I'm suspecting that he knew that he was lying all along, Irene. I really think that that was the case. And Paul Krugman has nailed it. Irene, thanks for the call, and thanks for bringing up a really important topic. It's good stuff. We'll be back with more of your calls right after this. It's coming up on 45 minutes past the hour. We're broadcasting live from Mike Papantonio's Mass Torts Made Perfect conference here in Las Vegas, Nevada, and having a fine time doing it. And I see our board is filled up with calls here. We'll be picking up your calls right after this short break.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with more of your calls right after this. And welcome back, Norma in Montgomery, Alabama. Hey, Norma, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Paul Ryan.
Yeah, okay, go for it.
I personally think that while we're all jumping for joy and relieved that Paul Ryan has resigned, I think that we are still in a great deal of danger because this is just April and he doesn't leave until January. Right now, a lot of us are working on getting people elected. Our primary here in Alabama is June the 5th. And then we have the midterm election in November. And I think that we need to continue to be vigilant and keep an eye on him because I don't think he's done. While we are all distracted, he can bring forth his bills to end Social Security or to steal it in whatever manner he thinks will profit himself the best. And we need to keep an eye on him because once the midterm celebrations or moaning and groaning start, we also have football season, we have Thanksgiving, and we have Christmas. And so those of us who are aware of the danger need to do what we can to keep our fellow citizens aware and keep watching the Senate calendar, the House calendar, and see if he brings forth bills and what the bills would do to moving Social Security into the hands of the banksters. Because I don't think that man.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Norma. And now that I mean, keep in mind, the two Santa Claus theory that Judah Wanniski laid out back in 1976 goes like this. When Republicans are in office, run up the debt. When Democrats are in office, scream about the debt and use that as a justification to cut social services and democratic programs, right? So now I think that they're going to go for a twofer. And it's going to be real interesting. And I think that Paul Ryan resigning is what facilitates this. So now what they're going to say is, well, the debt is so terrible that, you know, we've got to cut the social welfare programs. And Trump started this yesterday with his executive order to cut welfare programs and put work requirements into all of them.
Yeah.
So
we need to
now.
remember. Yeah.
Well, let me just finish this thought, Norma. Now Paul Ryan can say, well, you know, we did this giant tax reform, and now our tax system is where it should be, but we can no longer afford these welfare programs. And when people say, oh, but Paul Ryan, you're the one who's, you know, ruined the deficit, he'll say, yeah, I did, and I'm leaving. So you can't blame me for it. You know, it's like, you know, so he's accelerating the speed of two Santa Clauses. Back to you, Norma.
Well, I was just going to say, we need to remember the purpose behind that caucus room restaurant conspiracy. I don't think they're done. And I think that if we don't keep an eye on these people and make sure that we elect people who not only can spell integrity but understand it, we are still in danger. And to sit back and jump up and down that he's leaving, no, I think that he has one task left, and then he's going to come back and run for president in 2020. I don't think he's going to wait for 2024.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And I don't think he's going to run for president. I think him and Mitt Romney are going to reprise and all these Republicans are going to go, oh my God, Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, we would love them. Because Romney, like Jerry Ford to Richard Nixon. Go ahead.
One quick thing. We need to make sure there is no constitutional convention.
Yeah, absolutely. Norma, thank you. Thank you for the call. And thanks for watching Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. Chicago. Hey, John, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm well.
I do enjoy listening to your show because I do find you're being very historically informative, which I would have a question for you, but...
I hear a butt coming. Okay.
Well, it's just because that's not why I called you. That's why the butt is there.
Sure. Okay.
But I'm just curious why you're always going down the path of the doomsday scenario when none of these scenarios ever take place. Now we're going to head into nuclear war with Russia.
Okay, so hang on just a second, John. When Bush lied us into the war in Afghanistan, I said this is going to be a quagmire. Nobody has ever conquered Afghanistan. We're going to be there for decades if we decide to really do this. And then when he lied us into the war in Iraq, I said this is nuts. You're destroying an ancient civilization. You're opening the gates of hell was the phrase I repeatedly used on literally 1 million or 2 people who are dead now. And now you've got Donald Trump, and it was done for politics. George Bush told his biographer in 1999 that if he became president, he was going to invade Iraq and he was going to use the political power he got from being a war president to get reelected and to privatize Social Security. I mean, it's on the record. And Trump is doing the same thing. He is using war for political purposes. He's tweeting about it for God's sake. And there's I don't know if you read, John, or not, but Russia said, a Russian diplomat is on the record in the media, you can read it in the Post and the New York Times right now, saying that if we throw missiles into Syria, then they're going to take out the device that launched the missiles. That's an aircraft, that's a battleship in the Gulf. Russia has already told us if we launch those missiles, they're going to sink a battleship. Now, if Russia sinks a battleship, do you think we're not going to be at war with Russia?
Oh, I agree. I mean, that's a major problem. So then now let me ask you this. If we're at that type of tension with Russia, and this president is at that type of tension with Russia, how is he a Russian plant in the White House? How is he a Russian spy? How did he collude with Russia when it seems that he's at odds with Russia? None of it makes any sense to me, Tom. As a listener, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, my take on Trump and Russia is that when Trump went over, Trump wants to be a big international deal, right? And Russia's a very, very large country, and Moscow is a vibrant, city.
Napoleon learned that, right?
Yeah, right. And Trump wants to have a hotel there, and he's wanted to have a hotel there desperately for years. And to the extent that Russia wants to have influence in and with and on the United States, I think they've played him like a fiddle. Whether he's a plant, whether he's a spy, I'm skeptical of that kind of language, John. Clearly, they like him or liked him at some point, but I'm not going to go over the top on that. But the fact that he is so incompetent, he is tweeting, "Hey, Russia, look out, we might be sending missiles." And Russia's like, "Okay, cool. You do that and we'll take out your damn battleship."
Yes, I don't agree with any of that. And I am a Trump supporter, but I'm not one of the diehard ones. And there's a question that I now have for you. Tom, it seems that we have, I'm just going with quick numbers. 25% of us are on the far left. 25% of us are on the far right. How come we don't have a nice, solid, independent party in this country?
Well, because the Constitution was written in a way that facilitates a two-party system. We have first past the post winner take all elections. We do not
are in the middle.
Yeah, we do not have a parliamentary system. John, A, and B, 25% of us are not on the far left. The far left in the United States has maybe 1,000 members. The Communist Party of the United States, I don't think, has more than 1,000 members. There is no functional far left. If you're talking about the Franklin Roosevelt left, the LBJ left, that says that we should all have free health care and we should all have free education and that consumers should be protected, that's not the left. That's the center of America. The majority of Americans agree with those positions, John. The majority of Americans. So there is no far left in American politics. What you're fighting, you are on the far right. I get that. Trump using racism and misogyny and all these things. And authoritarianism. That is the hard right, and I'll acknowledge that. And in fact, we should all be very concerned about it. That's the Mussolini right, functionally. But I don't see a Stalin left in the United States. Do you? Really?
I think the far right is as large as the far left that you just described. It's the same amount of people.
I think what you're calling the far left is the middle in America.
I don't know about that. I mean,
if you've got 71% approval for Medicare for all, if you've got 69% approval for free college for all in the United States, how can you call that the far anything?
All right, I'm listening. I'm listening to you. I do listen.
Okay, thanks a lot, John. Appreciate the call. Yeah, good talking to you. Steve in Chicago. Steve, I think we just have about a minute here before we hit the end of this hour. Quick one.
Oh, wow.
Oh, we're hitting the break right now. Steve, I'm going to put you on hold. I'm sorry. We're hitting the break, and I'll pick you up on the other side of the break. I believe we have a guest in the first block of the next hour, but we will continue to pick up your phone calls. That's right. Our guest bailed. So cool. Steve, I will pick up your phone call, and everybody else, I'll pick up your calls right after the break here at the top of the hour. We're broadcasting live from Las Vegas from the Mass Torts Made Perfect Conference. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Unequal Protection, How Corporations Became People and How You Can Fight Back by Thom Hartmann. This is from the introduction titled The Battle to Save Democracy. Excuse me. On September 2nd, 2009, the transnational pharmaceutical giant Pfizer pled guilty to multiple criminal felonies. It had been marketing drugs in a way that may well have led to the deaths of people, and that definitely led physicians to prescribe and patients to use pharmaceuticals in a way that for which they were not intended. Because Pfizer is a corporation, a legal abstraction really, it couldn't go to jail like fraudster Bernie Madoff or killer John Dillinger. Instead, it paid a $1.2 billion criminal fine to the U.S. government, the biggest in history, as well as an additional $1 billion in civil penalties. The total settlement was more than $2.3 billion, another record. None of Pfizer's executives, decision makers, stockholders, owners, or employees saw even 5 minutes of the inside of a police station or a jail. Most Americans don't even know about this huge and massive crime, nor do they know that the criminal never spent a day in jail. But they do know that in the autumn of 2004, Martha Stewart was convicted of lying to investigators about her sale of stock in another pharmaceutical company. Her crime cost nobody their life, but she famously was escorted off to a women's prison. Had she been a corporation instead of a human being, odds are there would not have even been an investigation. Yet over the past century, and particularly the past 40 years, corporations have repeatedly asserted that they are, in fact, persons, and therefore eligible for the human rights protections of the Bill of Rights. In 2009, the right-wing advocacy group Citizens United argued before the Supreme Court that they had the First Amendment right to free speech and to influence elections through the production and distribution of a slasher documentary designed to destroy Hillary Clinton's ability to win the Democratic nomination. Some political observers assert that they did this in part because they believed that a black man whose first name sounded like Osama and whose middle name was Hussein could never, ever possibly win against a Republican, no matter how poor a candidate they put up. In that, they were following on a 2003 case before the Supreme Court in which Nike claimed it had the First Amendment right to lie in its corporate marketing, a variation of the First Amendment right of free speech. Corporations haven't limited their grasp to the First Amendment. Pretty much any and virtually every amendment that could be used to further corporate interests has been fair game. As you'll learn in this book, in previous decades, a chemical company took to the Supreme Court a case asserting its Fourth Amendment right to privacy from the EPA, snooping into its illegal chemical discharges. Other corporations have asserted Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, as well as asserting the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War to strip slavery from the Constitution, asserting that it protects their right against discrimination by a local community that doesn't want them building a toxic waste incinerator, commercial hog operations, or superstores. If this trend continues, it's probably just a matter of time before a corporation claims the Second Amendment right to bear arms anywhere, anytime, and your credit card company's bill collector shows up at your home with a sidearm. This legal situation is not only bizarre, but also quite the opposite of the visions for this country held by the founders of the nation and the framers of the Constitution. They were sufficiently worried about corporate power that they didn't even include in the Constitution the word corporation, intending instead that the states should tightly regulate corporate behavior, which the states did quite well until just after the Civil War. The American Revolution, you'll learn in this book, was in fact provoked by the misbehavior of a British corporation. Our nation was founded in an anti-corporate power fury. The most significant and oft-quoted precedent of the turning point of corporate power in America began just after the Civil War. It rested on a constitutional amendment successfully written and passed by a group of radical Republicans after the Civil War. That's what they called themselves, radical Republicans, to take slavery out of the Constitution. Given that today's Republican Party has, largely since the robber baron era of the 1880s, been the party of big business and the very rich, it's a bit difficult for some people to get their minds around the possibility that the Republican Party started out as a reform party, that for nearly 70 years, from before Abraham Lincoln until just after Theodore Roosevelt left the party to start a third party, had a strong progressive wing. But the Republican Party did. Although Lincoln was, by today's standards, a moderate Republican, he was still anti-slavery, pro-middle class, and pro-labor. In fact, he famously said labor is superior to capital because it precedes capital. Nobody has wealth until somebody makes something. And he was the first president both to use the word strike in public and to actually stop police and private armies from killing and beating strikers. And just like in today's mainstream Democratic Party, where there's a progressive minority that always seems to be pushing the edges, in the Republican Party of the 1800s, there was a very, even by today's standards, progressive faction. The radical Republicans were a splinter group that emerged in a big way from the Republican Party at its founding in 1854. And just after the Civil War in 1866, they gained a majority among Republicans in the House of Representatives, where they had a powerful influence until the faction disintegrated in the 1870s during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. They supported the absolute right of freed slaves to vote and participate in government. It goes on from there. Unequal protection, corporate power. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Jamie Bartlett. Jamie is the author of a new book, The People versus Tech, How the Internet is Killing Democracy. Jamie, and he's the director of the Center for Analysis of Social Media at Demos, the think tank. His previous books, The Dark Net, an examination of the hidden corners of the Internet, and Radicals, Outsiders Changing the World. Demos.org, of course, is the website. You can tweet Jamie at Jamie Bartlett, B-A-R-T-L-E-T-T, at Jamie Bartlett. Excuse me, at Jamie J. Bartlett. Do I have all that right, Jamie?
You got nearly all of that right. You made one small mistake. Our website is demos.co.uk. There's an American think tank with the same name as us, but we're different.
Ah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So thank you for the correction. Yeah, great. So your new book, The People versus Tech. Tell me, how is the internet killing democracy?
Well, it's killing it slowly and under the guise of progress, which is why it's so difficult to spot. What I think is happening here is that we have an old system of democracy, representative government, and we've built it up over several decades with mass political parties and all these institutions that really make it work: a free press, a strong middle class, informed citizens who are willing to compromise with each other, a justice system that actually works to deal with crime. And suddenly we have imported this brand new digital technology that plays by a completely different set of rules, is borderless, hard to censor, hard to control, grows and improves exponentially. And in each of these kind of big pillars that I explained, that new technology is just unraveling, eroding the strength of those pillars. And what worries me is people will lose confidence in democracy as a system that actually works.
So let's concretize this. Give me an example.
Well, I suppose the most relevant and obvious one right now is the story of Cambridge Analytica, Russian disinformation, Facebook, and the election. This is a prime example of how, certainly in my country, but also in yours, we had a set of rules about how elections would work, and that involved being very transparent about how money was spent on elections. And in the UK, at least, I know that political parties would have to declare all the money and show the adverts that they were displaying during the campaign, so regulators could check they were roughly honest. Now,
right, this is all in the context of the old media.
This is all in the old media, which to some extent was controllable, and we had rules for it. And then suddenly you have a brand new system of doing politics, very highly targeted, direct, micro-targeting of people who we've built up with profiles of all the things they've done online. And that's a very, very different way of doing elections, and it's much harder for the regulators to keep on top of.
So, what do we do?
Well, the first thing we do, I suppose, is panic, which is one of the reasons
I think we're there.
This book. Exactly, yeah. I think we are there, and I think the last few weeks, in a way, have been very helpful in making people understand quite what's going on. And then I think we start to act. So we will need more regulation of the internet. I think it's very important, and it's part of how we try to move an old politics into this new setting. The recent appearance of Mark Zuckerberg in front of the House of Congress committees was an example, actually, of the politicians saying, well, we think we might need to regulate you, and him saying, we can handle this ourselves. But I think in the long run, we will need more regulation. So there's a lot of areas where we've got to regulate things. But I think we're going to need to be very, very imaginative, too. I mean, we're going to have to help unions reform in a digital age. We're going to have to try to defend the middle class, defend the media. These are important things that keep democracy working. And then some of it's down on us, on citizens. You know, we have to realize
what
that
sort of... No, I get it, Jamie, but what sort of regulation are you proposing?
So when it comes to elections, for example, I think that you have actually in America the Honest Ads Act, which is going to give a bit more transparency to political campaigning. Absolutely. You should also be introducing more data protection so individual people have the right to opt out of all of this data collection stuff. That's important because the ad-based model of social media is premised on keeping us addicted and constantly collecting information about us that can also be used by politicians. There are many benefits to this, of course, but I think it does harm politics. And so laws to protect more against the use of personal information will be vital. I think, for example, every time there is an election, every political party, because let's be honest, this isn't just Donald Trump, they are all doing this, every political party is going to have a register which shows every person they've targeted, how they've targeted them, what messages they've shown to them, because we have to have some mechanism by which we hold those technologies accountable. And so one of the things more... Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say this is part of a bigger thing, which is more and more decisions are taken that are very important through algorithms and big data, machine learning technology. And it's very sophisticated and complicated. And I think you saw in the recent hearings with Zuckerberg that a lot of senators don't really understand it. But we have to develop a right for senators or for political bodies to somehow be able to look at those algorithms and judge whether they are fair, whether they are discriminating against people. There needs to be a democratic system to hold this technology to account.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. With the previous comment that you had, the transparency in advertising, this is the problem I have with Citizens United. Justice Kennedy, actually there have been a series of them over the years, but it wasn't Alito. Oh, Scalia. That's right. Scalia wrote the majority opinion. Well, no, Kennedy wrote the majority opinion. It was Scalia's words, essentially, in Citizens United. And what Kennedy said in Citizens United was that the solution to dark money, the question is, what happens when a group of billionaires come in and say, you know, we're going to drop $400 million into an election, which is what the Koch brothers said a few months ago about this coming election here this November. We're going to drop $400 million in. And the way that they're going to do it is they've got this group called Concerned Vets, I think is the name of it. And so they're going to run patriotic ads saying, we are veterans and we support this Republican candidate who's going to wipe out your Social Security. But they don't quite say all that, you know. And so they and then they've got another group, which is Young People for Health Care. And of course, they want to do away with Medicare and Medicaid. And so when you've got dark forces, for lack of a better phrase, when you've got, you know, billionaires who are trying to rig the economy on the one hand for their own benefit, oh, there's no such thing as global warming, keep pumping that oil, it's very profitable for us, by the way. And then on the other hand, hey, we're ideologues, we believe that there's no such, we agree with Maggie Thatcher, there's no such thing as society, there's only a collection of individuals, every individual should be on their own, you know, sorry you were born with muscular dystrophy, tough luck kid, you're on your own. When you've got those kinds of people and they've got literally access to hundreds of billions of dollars, willing to spend hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in individual elections, regulating political parties is meaningless.
Yes. You mean regular political parties? They're meaningless.
Yeah.
They don't have power.
Yeah, and just telling people, hey, this information came from the Koch brothers, people will go, so what? The damage is done. The message has been delivered. Jamie, I'm sorry, we're out of time. I missed my time cue. I wouldn't have gone so long in my rant there. But it's great talking with you. Jamie Bartlett, his new book is called The People versus Tech. Check it out. Jamie, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, good talking with you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with your calls right after this. Stick around. Welcome back. Lewis, watching Free Speech TV in Picayune, Mississippi. Am I saying the town right there, Lewis?
Yes, I think I got my speakerphone off. Hi, Tom. Third-time caller, first time in around 10 years. Yeah, I just wanted to bring up a conspiracy theory I had about Charlottesville and why the police didn't act.
Mm-hmm.
Are you there, Tom? Oh, okay.
I am. I'm listening.
Yeah, I think the reason that the police didn't take part in stopping the violence was because they recognized a lot of their fellow officers among Trump's good people on both sides, so to speak. And I don't know, I just wanted to run that. I haven't heard anybody say it, and it just seems obvious to me. Just wondering, if you had anything to say about that or anything.
I agree that that's a possibility, Lewis, and one of the things that we're seeing, and Trump has been shouting out to these people from the very beginning of his campaign, yes, we love the police, yes, we love the military. He knows that they have the physical power, right? He may have the political power and the economic power, but they have the physical power. They have the ability to put people in prison. They have the ability to make people's lives hell. They have, frankly, the ability to kill people, and they do it regularly. In fact, about 1,000 times a year, police kill people in the United States. And so Trump realizes that, and he has been sucking up to these people like there's no tomorrow. And the police unions and police departments all over the country are very, very heavily pro-Trump. And the consequence of that is that when you are protesting Trump's policies, excuse me, when you're protesting Trump's policies or supporting Trump's policies, you're going to see the police you in a way that reflects their own personal preferences. And I believe that I have seen that via the eye of the lens of news coverage, because I have not attended any of these. I wasn't in Charlottesville, for example, but I think that it's so obvious you can even pick it up on the news media. It sure seems to me like the cops are favoring the Nazis, basically, and going out of their way to brutalize anti-Trump protesters, including kettling them. We saw this in Washington, D.C., and beating them, imprisoning them, giving them body cavity searches where they're sticking their fingers inside them, in sometimes rather public ways, humiliating them. And it concerns me tremendously because right now it's writ small. It's being done, it's being done to a few hundred people here and there occasionally. In Pinochet's Chile, it was done writ large. Everybody was vulnerable to this. Anybody was potentially subject to it. You didn't even have to be part of a demonstration. All you had to do was say something they didn't like. And if they heard about it from an informant, well, now they don't even need the informants anymore. They can just read your Facebook feed and your Twitter feed and decide that they're going to take you down. And the slow and steady transfer of power to police departments that began with the Reagan administration and began with a hyper-militarization of police with the 1088 program that Reagan put into place, where police departments could get, at virtually no cost, police departments could get weapons of war. They could suit themselves up like the mutant ninja teenage turtle, right? The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They could, basically pretend to be the military. And they are, and they do. I think that that's a very, very, very bad thing for the United States. It's not something that most other countries are doing, at least in the big way that we're doing it. Louis, thank you for the call, and thanks for raising the issue. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Let's pick up your calls here. Steve in Chicago. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind?
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to make a couple of points. A previous caller had suggested this notion that somehow there's this parity between the left and the right in this country, and I agree with you that that's just nonsensical. Well, what happened, especially during the Obama era, was that people on the right wanted to conflate the idea of entities like the Progressive Caucus and whatnot as being something akin to a Stalinist left or a Maoist left, which is utter nonsense.
And there's no such, the Stalinist and Maoist left in the United States is fringe malcontents, basically. I mean, there's something to be said for studying those philosophies and things, but as a practical application of political power in the United States of America in 2018, it does not exist.
Right. When we talk about progressives, we're talking about people who adhere to philosophies which you find in terms of public policy in Western Europe. So we need to be clear about that. That's correct. Secondly, I would tend to disagree with you on a couple of points. For instance, the notion of trade, just because there is a trade deficit doesn't mean that you get nothing out of that. I mean, the idea that that you paid less for something, substantially less, you got something for that. And the fact that if there's a trade deficit, well, there is an advantage for you as a customer because you get to pay a lot less for things, and therefore that money can be diverted to other things like education and housing, healthcare, and so forth. So
I strongly disagree, Steve. Before you go on to any other points, unless you want to expand on what you just said, let's finish this topic.
I do, because this needs to be a conversation that delves into specifics. There are certain industries, for instance, that to take, for instance, producing sweat socks. I don't think in this day and age that this society should be in the business of trying to be competitive in producing sweat socks. That there is a competitive advantage to allowing other people to do that outside of the borders of this country, and that we should simply cede that to other countries and let them go ahead and have that advantage. Whereas
I think that's suicide.
Again, this is the point that I'm trying to make, that it's almost impossible for you to try and compete with those countries, and that secondly,
no, it's not true.
Way to do so.
It's not true. We made sweat socks in the United States for years and years. And people made $15 an hour making them.
That's right, exactly. And that was reflected in terms of what you paid for those socks.
That's correct. But see, Steve, I don't mind paying more for my sweat socks if my salary's gone from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour.
But the problem here is that you've missed out on a number of variables. Number one, that should those jobs come back to the United States, this is not 1950 any longer, that a lot of that work is going to be done through mechanization, by machinery, and computerization. Sure. Exactly.
That's no reason to give it up. Steve, the big issue here with international trade, let me just lay this out, if I may, and feel free to, if you think you can take this apart, I'd love to hear it, because I don't think you can. We buy cheap stuff manufactured in China. We give China our money. They give us the cheap stuff.
They make a profit on that. They've got our money. Now China, we have a trade deficit, they have a trade surplus. Now China, broadly speaking, is sitting on literally trillions of dollars of US dollars. The only place they can really spend that ultimately is here in the United States. So what do? They come to the United States and they buy our companies. They come to the United States and they buy our housing. We're having an explosion of housing prices, I wouldn't say values, up and down the West Coast right now because of wealthy Chinese, including the upper third of the Chinese middle class now, buying housing as a way to, U.S. housing as a way to protect their money. And by the way, many other countries will not allow you to buy land and housing and businesses in their countries unless you're a resident or unless you have fit certain requirements. We don't do that. They buy our companies, they buy our buildings, they buy our industry, they buy our office buildings. 1/7 of all assets in the United States right now are foreign owned. When Reagan came into office, that was less than one, it was like 0.03%. It's now 1/7. What that means, and I don't mean this in a jingoistic sense, oh my God, the Chinese are coming, they don't look like us. That's not what I'm saying at all. That's what Pat Buchanan might say. What I'm saying is when they own our assets and those assets generate profits, where do those profits go? They go back to China. And this is not just China, by the way. We have a trade deficit with Germany as well. And the result of that is that slowly you lose your sovereignty. You lose your ability to have a functioning economy. We cannot, right now, we are 100%, for example, we are 100% dependent on China for rare earth minerals. We cannot make cell phones, we cannot make missiles, we cannot make any high-tech equipment, hospital equipment, we can't make any of it without rare earth minerals from China. Now, we have rare earth mines in the United States. The largest was in California. We shut it down 15 years ago because we couldn't compete with China on price because they were subsidizing their exports. They basically put us out of that business. We now can't make a cruise missile without parts from China. We can't make an aircraft carrier without parts from China. And that is a disaster. It's a political disaster. It's a sovereignty disaster. And frankly, it's a national security disaster.
Okay, let's be fair. You tried to unwrap a lot there, and if I took the time.
No, this is the simple crux of the whole thing.
But
you called about the trade deficit. I'm talking about the trade deficit.
Number one, yes. Again, number one, you're talking about things like, for instance, the idea that we can't make this. No, we've chosen not to because the Chinese have a competitive advantage and can provide rare earth minerals for our industries.
Steve, that is not true. We have chosen to because
we've chosen not to. I said we've chosen not to because they have an advantage.
But you said, because they have a competitive advantage, they don't. You're talking you're talking Ricardo and Smith, the theory of comparative advantage, actually. And the theory of comparative advantage, as laid out back in the late 18th, the late 18th and early 19th century, was typically was associated with climate and growing conditions. If you live in a region where grapes grow for wine, and you're trading with somebody who does not have the ability to grow grapes, but they've got sheep that they can make wool out of, then you should sell them wine and they should sell you wool. That is not what's going on here. China has rigged the system for this. They undercut us on rare earth minerals, not because it was necessarily cheaper for them to produce, but because they're subsidizing it. But the bottom line, Steve, is you lose your country. We used to do this to other countries.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Sorry, Steve. When we're on remote, we have hard breaks. I can't control it, but call back later on, and not today, but next week, and we'll continue this debate. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today our book is George Lynn's Breaking the Trance. We're reading from Chapter 2. The title, Brains Awash in Adrenaline, What Overclocking the Brain Does to the Bodies, Minds, and Nervous Systems of Screen-Dependent Children. That would be as in computer and, phone screens. Quote, we design our games to hook them in. Part of the hook is how we build the games, to deliberately overclock their minds. Most people think at about 600 words a minute. We make them think at 1,000 words a minute. End of quote. This revelation was said in the course of a conversation with an executive of a large gaming company. This man thought that there was nothing wrong with what he was doing. In fact, he said, quote, "We hire PhDs in psychology to help engineer our games to be successful, to get kids stuck on them," end quote. In order for a video game or other screen medium to be financially successful, two things in terms of brain function should occur. It must be fun, which increases the availability of pleasure neurons in the brain, and it must create a strong tendency toward compulsive use. A screen medium must contain what game manufacturers term compulsion loops, meaning the game is programmed to pull children into the play and then repeatedly frustrate them while offering incremental rewards as they play, as the play proceeds through various levels. To build brain dependence on a particular screen medium, use of the medium has to be exciting. In terms of function of the human nervous system, it has to trigger the general adaptation syndrome, the GAS, also known as the fight or flight stress reaction pattern. When the GAS comes on, it blows vast amounts of adrenaline into the nervous system. Child and adolescent clients with bipolar disorder, as well as those with an issue with screen dependence, say they can actually feel adrenaline as heat rising upward from the midriff. Adrenaline is felt as excitement. It is this excitement that pulls a child into the pattern of chronic screen use and dependence. The brain develops long-term dependence on screen media use through the accumulation of the chemical precursor to adrenaline, which is dopamine. The following diagram provides an overview of how dopamine leads to dependence over time, and he's got a nice diagram of this. Dependence on a particular medium follows the chronic release of adrenaline. Even if the child becomes angry or frustrated playing a particular video game, the experience of adrenaline while in this angry state is felt as pleasure. Many of the children and adolescents we work with tell us that it feels really good to get really angry. For them, breaking things in a fit of angry frustration while playing a video game actually has a payoff. The payoff is an elevation in adrenaline, which feels good. The more adrenaline released, the greater the dependence. Research suggests that a massive multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG, is the most adrenalized screen medium. Examples are League of Legends, World of Warcraft, and Clash of Clans. But children may also become dependent on the experience of their minds floating through hours of YouTube videos or searching or surfing on Twitter or Snapchat as a behavior-shaping force, pushing their behavior in certain predictable directions. As adrenaline goes up, the brain goes into hyperdrive, and the child experiences a period of enhanced focus on his screen media. As screen media use continues uninterrupted for hours, more disturbing results are seen. Research shows that these media present highly arousing, abnormal sensory inputs to the brain's activating system. Downstream effects of this arousal include a markedly decreased attention span, an increase in brain metabolism patterns similar to that seen in drug addicts, an increase in short-term aggression for violent video games, especially in younger children and boys, along with an increased likelihood of later antisocial behavior, deterioration of brain executive functioning, which includes remembering, planning, and inhibiting impulsivity, increased vigilance, irritability, and depression, sleep disorders, development of anxiety disorders, and the risk of receiving a diagnosis of ADHD at age 7 that increases with every hour of media use for young children. If a child uses recreational screen media for more than an hour a day, some of the downstream effects noted in the previous section will start to materialize. The brain can deal with screen media use in moderation, but if it is pushed by a compulsion loop, damage will occur. Chronic excessive screen time eventually exhausts the brain with the buildup of corticotrophin-releasing factor, CRF, that accompanies adrenaline. This neurochemical kicks the brain into high gear when so commanded by the stress reaction and stimulates the release of cortisol. Cortisol pushes the nervous system into action, but if stress goes on chronically, the presence of cortisol can result in damage to the brain's memory circuits and other structures tasked to attention, mood, and impulse control. As stated earlier, brain executive function is impacted by chronic screen overuse. Stress retards the function of the brain center tasked for memory, the hippocampus. And when this happens, the child's short-term memory will start slipping. He will forget things and become disorganized. His ability to think efficiently and solve problems or remember basic facts will slip. Homework hour becomes hell hour, with his parents trapped in the role of suspicious overseers. The brain can heal, but it needs time and cessation of the hyperadrenalized state for a period to recharge.
If it does not get this relief, the kindling effects begins, causing the deterioration of brain structures associated with mood stability. Chronic play causes the child to experience anxiety and a mild to moderate irritable depression. Research on the impact of these mood states suggests that if depression or anxiety remains untreated, it becomes worse over time. The slow burn eventually engulfs the brain. George Lynn's book, Breaking the Trance. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you live from Las Vegas. We're broadcasting from the Mass Torts Made Perfect conference, Mike Papatonio's conference. And here with us, I'm so happy to have, and we've got the shot framed, so he's in the shot, right, Louise? Okay, great. Here with us is Farron Cousins, co-host of Ring of Fire on YouTube.com daily and contributor to the Smog blog, executive editor of Trial Lawyer Magazine, TRO Fire, and youtube.com/The Ring of Fire. Farron, welcome. Welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
Thanks for having me. It's great seeing you again.
Great having you with us. So there's a lot of stuff that you've been reporting on and ranting about, and I wanted to catch up with you on this. Shell oil, let's start with that.
Yeah, that's a big one that came out within the last week and a half. All of these documents have been uncovered from Shell, much like happened with Exxon a few years ago.
These documents, what do you...
Well, internal documents from the company that show that back in the early 1980s, they understood that their emissions, their company, their practices, everything they were doing was contributing to what they didn't realize at the time was climate change, but they understood it was destroying the environment, putting these pollutants in the air, and causing the greenhouse effect, what we called it back then. So they knew it back in the 1980s. They understood it. They had their own scientists warning them that, hey, we're destroying this planet. We're going to cause this long-term warming trend because of what we do. So Shell executives, how do we go forward with this? So Shell had two options at that point, and these are pointed out on the documents. We can come to the public, we can say, all right, we found out we're screwing things up, we need to do something about this, or, and this is the option Shell went with, obviously, we're going to cover it up, we're going to bury it, we're going to muddy the waters, we're going to create, these little grassroots organizations that, make things a little less clear, spread doubt, misinformation, and that's where we are today. After 40 years of this.
This is not a new strategy. In the early 1930s, they concluded definitively that asbestos caused mesothelioma, which is what killed my father. I mean, this is real personal for me. And they buried it. They covered it up. They did exactly what you're describing. The asbestos industry did. They finally went down in about a decade ago, a little more than that, a couple decades ago, I guess. And then the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry knew by the 1950s. Definitively. I mean, it had been speculated for a century, but they knew definitively by the 1950s that their product was killing literally 500,000 or 1 million, actually back then, more than 1 million Americans every year. And yet they were continuing to give, the way my dad got hooked is he went off to World War II, and every week he got 2 cartons of Lucky Strikes for free from the tobacco companies. Every soldier in his, in his army, whatever it was, battalion or platoon or whatever they call it, got it, and they were over there stationed in Japan, and they got their cigarettes, and he was addicted for the rest of his life. And so, and then, Shell and, ExxonMobil did the same thing. Yeah. So, I don't know about Koch Industries. They're not so much a developer or a producer, but are they all literally playing from the same playbook? I know some of the same scientists have been involved in both tobacco and climate denial.
They really are. I mean, everybody is operating off this same, we knew it before the scientists in this country came public, so we got the jump on it, we're going to cover it up. We share scientists. The big story, a decade or so ago revealed of Exxon offering, I think it was $10,000 to any scientist willing to come out and write a paper saying that climate change is a hoax, it's not real, the science doesn't support it. Oh yeah, it was a big, well, it should have been a big story. It wasn't that big. And this is something Pap talked about all the time, because these are the kinds of scientists that he goes up against that represent these corporations that have to come out and say, no, our pollutants didn't cause your cancer. It was, air quality. You lived a poor lifestyle. That's why you're suffering this disease.
You didn't get enough vitamin D.
Yeah, not what Monsanto or DuPont had done to you.
Right.
And they do. They hire, as Pap calls them, biostitutes, and they're willing to go out there and create any kind of phony science that won't stand up, under any kind of scrutiny. It's not peer reviewed, but people see it comes from a scientist, and they say, okay, well, scientist A says this and scientist B says that. I guess it's somewhere in between. But that's not how it is with climate science, and we know that now. Right. There's no such thing as science denial anymore. It's denying reality.
Yeah.
And so
it's Flat Earth Society.
It is.
So I mentioned the asbestos industry and the tobacco industry very specifically for the purpose of showing that we have, through the mechanism of the group that you're associated with, trial lawyers, we have taken down entire industries by suing them and saying, you can't do that to us anymore. I mean, asbestos and tobacco are still doing it to us, but the harm has been somewhat mitigated.
Right.
And here we're not talking about killing 500,000 Americans a year, which tobacco continues to do. We're talking about the possibility of rendering the planet sterile for mammalian life, basically, for the life of anything larger than a dog. If we were to see something like the Permian mass extinction or even the PETM, these extinction events caused by global warming. So do you think that there's a very real possibility, and are you seeing any efforts out there by people like the trial lawyers at this conference to stand up and say, okay, we're going to take you suckers down?
It is remarkable because there are so many different lawsuits from different groups, different organizations, different plaintiffs right now against all of these companies. We have our Children's Trust. Every time they've gone in front of a judge, the judge has allowed the case to go forward.
Is this the group that is associated with the climate scientist from NASA, whose name is?
Hansen.
Yeah, James Hansen.
Yes.
On behalf of his granddaughter.
Right. And so, this one, that was one of the first major ones, and they're going after, state, local governments, federal governments for their inaction. They're going after them for the pipelines. And the judges who have looked at it in these preliminary hearings have said, you have standing. You make a valid argument, your evidence looks credible, you get to proceed, much to the chagrin of the oil companies and the regulators who have allowed this to happen. In California, you've got at least 10 different cities suing oil companies for the costs of sea level rise, because they're having to work on all these mitigation plans, spend all this money because their towns are going to be underwater in a few decades.
Well, and some of them, Miami Beach right now, they're having to put pumps in.
Exactly, and I forget the name of the small island in Louisiana, but they're currently working on having to move an entire population off of an island in Louisiana because they've only got a few years left. And that's what people have to understand. This isn't the far-off threat, that we thought it was when Al Gore was running for president. It wasn't, 50, 100 years away. These are things that are happening now, and just like with our Children's Trust, these other lawsuits, the judges are moving forward. They're going to go to trial. Recently, a judge said that he wants to bring climate science, the scientists from the corporations, the other independent scientists, he wants to bring them in, have them all present their evidence. So basically, he's putting the science itself on trial. And if he does the right thing, if he does side with the real scientist over the biostitutes, that's going to change the game. That's going to change the conversation. That's going to be the legally recognized truth in the court system.
Which court is this being adjudicated?
Gosh, I forget.
It's a federal court?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's interesting. What happens when that gets to the Supreme Court, where you've got 5-4, maybe even 6-3 ratio of wackadoodles, who some of them, Neil Gorsuch's mom, Ann Gorsuch, was Reagan's EPA administrator, and she was worse than Scott Pruitt in many ways, and she had to resign in disgrace. That's his mom. What's he going to do on the Supreme Court?
Well, even during the Bush years, we had the conservative Supreme Court when the, I believe it was Clean Air Act came up in front of them. They actually ruled and said, no, EPA, you have to enforce this Clean Air Act. That is your job.
With regard to carbon dioxide.
Right. And so I don't want to say I have hope with anyone on that court, but, we've seen them shock us in the past. It could happen here. You know, it could be 5 years before this case makes it to the Supreme Court.
Right.
So we're not sure exactly what the makeup at that point will be.
Yeah. That's interesting.
But so far we're making so much progress.
We're talking with Farron Cousins, co-host of Ring of Fire on YouTube.com, daily contributor to the DeSmog blog, and executive editor, Trial Lawyer Magazine. Farron, we have about a minute and a half here left. Thoughts on Scott Pruitt?
I'm glad that people are talking about the EPA finally. It's just very disappointing they're not talking about all the regulations that he is trying to walk back. Yeah. That's the story. You know, there was a great story on Think Progress a couple days ago talking about the fact that if Scott Pruitt is successful in his agenda of repeal, 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 we're talking 100,000 deaths per year that are going to happen if we take away all the rules that he wants to take away. If we want to take back the Clean Power Plan, 100,000 a year. And this is
dead Americans.
Yes.
But the impact will be worldwide. I mean, it could be millions of people dead, but just in America, 100,000.
Absolutely.
Because of Scott Pruitt.
Because he wants to pay back the oil companies. He's willing to sell the lives of 100,000 people in America every year just to pay them back a little bit. So yeah, he paid $50 a night for his condo. Fantastic. He's going to get people killed if he fulfills his agenda, and that's the bigger story there.
Yeah, and the corporate media in this country does not want to touch that story, tragically, because they're still pandering to the idea that, well, there's a debate about these things.
Right.
I mean, it's beyond bizarre. It's criminal. Farron Cousins, co-host of Ring of Fire on YouTube.com daily, contributor to the DeSmog blog, executive editor of Trial Lawyer Magazine. You can, the website, TRO Fire, as in the ring of, trofire.com, and of course on YouTube /The Ring of Fire. And you can tweet him at Farron, F-A-R-R-O-N, Balanced. Farron Balanced. Cool. Farron, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Great having you with us.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day right after this. And welcome back. Graham, watching us on Free Speech TV in Asheville, North Carolina. Hey, Graham, what's on your mind today?
Tom, I love you. Well, you know, long-time listener, first-time caller, and I just was calling to respond to what you read from the book Breaking the Trance, George Lynn's book. And and I'm a political cartoonist, and over the years I've had various, done various art jobs and so forth. But when you read that excerpt, it reminded me that back in the 80s, I was hired to work for a major company that does branding and marketing and merchandising for products for all sorts of major companies. And in this instance, I got hired to work on creating an image for a Saturday morning cartoon by Warner Brothers and produced by Steven Spielberg called Animaniacs. And your screener grew up on this cartoon. I was in my mid-20s, and I wasn't watching cartoons, so they gave me a one sheet to familiarize myself with what this cartoon was about. And it blew my mind. I couldn't believe it, and I was really pissed off. But the description of this Animaniacs cartoon was that it was a cartoon, and I'm just remembering the best I can, but they said it was a cartoon meant to stimulate and adrenalize kids and make them hyper and annoying enough that after they saw this, they would repeatedly annoy their parents enough that the kids would then, begging for the toys and the products that were in between in the advertisements to annoy their parents enough that they'd eventually capitulate and buy these toys.
They just actually explicitly said that?
It actually said that. And I couldn't believe it. And I was really ashamed that, I'd seen Jaws and whatever Steven Spielberg had done up to then. And I thought, this is crazy. But this is, I'd always known about, the manipulation of advertising. But it said this on this one sheet that the goal was to make these kids hyper enough and crazy enough. And if you were to watch the cartoon, it makes no sense. It's these little characters that are knockoffs of Mickey Mouse that somehow come to life, and they live on the Warner Brother lot. Nothing made sense, but it was hyper activity all the time. And it was like the Three Stooges and the Tasmanian Devil on steroids. But
Graham, let me swap stories with you. Back in the early 70s, in 73, 74, I was a partner in an advertising agency in Lansing, Michigan. It was called Terra Graphics. And our largest client was one of the very large cereal companies based, well, I don't want to identify them beyond that, but we did work for a couple of banks and things. Yeah, and the job that I had for them, my partner Terry was a brilliant artist and cartoonist, and he did the graphics. In fact, we did the cover for one of their cereal boxes. I mean, the box. We did the front of the box for them. And they wanted me to write and Terry to design a booklet that they were going to distribute into all the public schools in America. Hundreds of thousands, millions of these booklets. And it was 24 pages. I wrote it. It was called Sugar, the Essential Nutrient. And I am still burning the karma from that thing, right? But they actually at least presented sugar as something that helps your body. I mean, it came across, maybe, and in retrospect, I'm guessing it was entirely disingenuous. But that's amazing. Graham, thanks for the call. Back in here with you, and let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. On the line with us is Tom Squitieri of Talk Media News. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do, Ellen Ratner's new book. Tom, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. Happy to be back. Happy Thursday.
Yeah, back at you. So what's up in the news? What are the top stories of the day?
Well, we're watching Syria, of course, wondering what's happening on that. And the word is out that Sweden, not surprisingly, has pushed forward a proposal to the United Nations that would establish a disarmament mission to Syria to address the issue of chemical weapons and others. It's interesting because Sweden is obviously considered a neutral country and doesn't have a foot in either camp. And their proposal might be able to get to the United Nations, where a proposal from Russia or the United States may not. Now, why is this important? It gives the United States a credible, faith-saving way to step back from the threat of a military attack on Syria, with or without Britain and France in tow. There was something said by Secretary Mattis yesterday to us as he entered the Pentagon about how the Allies, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but the Allies are still trying to determine precisely, the evidence of who did the chemical attack, what kind of chemicals, et cetera. There's that kind of, not skepticism, but the sort of the due diligence that's being performed that President Trump sort of raced ahead of when he said we're going to do something within 48 hours, a deadline which passed yesterday. So, everyone's ready to act, but no one really knows why. And this does have the situation in the Middle East to escalate quickly, with Israel and Iran and Turkey, all sorts of different players coming at it from different
and Saudi Arabia,
in Saudi Arabia as well. So we have that going on, and what's so funny is, to me, and I say funny with quote marks, is while this crisis is indeed a true crisis, we have a parade of people going to Capitol Hill testifying on the budget. So you happen to have budget hearings today. Defense Secretary Mattis is up there. The head of the Joint Chiefs is up there. Various other military officials are talking into different subcommittees. Mike Pompeo, who's the nominee to be next Secretary of State, is having a very testy hearing on Capitol Hill about his nomination. And so you have this sort of bureaucratic machine working on the Hill with hearings while this other crisis is sort of playing in different parts of the world.
Right, and this is, let's not mince words here. This is ultimately a diplomatic crisis. I mean, if you're going to avoid war, that's what you use, is diplomacy.
You're absolutely
our
correct.
Head diplomat has resigned.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And that's why the offer that's reported from Sweden, I haven't seen it myself, but I believe the Associated Press has pretty good sources on this. That is a sort of a door that opens that gives all sides that face-saving way to resolve this diplomatically, and not saying, well, we're letting Russia take credit, we're letting the United States take credit. No, we're letting Sweden take credit through the United Nations, which is an acceptable way to many parties. I don't think that with all its bluster, Syria really wants to have a military strike from NATO, France, Britain, and the United States. No matter what they say, they don't. And Russia, despite its bluster, doesn't want to have to confront the United States at all. They have a free hand right now in Syria. They're playing the long game there on the ground. So Sweden's offer to have a work through the United Nations Security Council may be the way to resolve this, actually, diplomatically, to go in once and for all and see if there are chemical weapons there, which is important, but do it in a way that avoids a shooting war.
Yeah. There's a bunch of things that in particular, the fact that they're using chlorine, which is readily available for industrial use, was used during World War I. But generally, chlorine is not used as a poison gas because it's such a blunt instrument. It's going after a fly with a shotgun, but it's readily available. And so you would think if Assad really wanted to kill people and take people out, he would use one of the more sophisticated nerve agents. But and that's
Tom,
one of the arguments.
I hear you on that.
Let me
just be counterintuitive a little bit here. I tend to think that us smart folks here in the West, we overthink these things sometimes. There's a much better, more efficient way to use poisonous gas, a different kind of gas. But if you use chlorine, as you just said, it's readily available, and people could say, well, look, anybody can get that. It could have been anybody that used that. So they might be building a little deniability. I'm just being provocative a little bit, but
that's a good point, Tom. That's a very good point.
This whole thing,
that's a very good point.
Thing about who did it, why they do it, what's the end game, what's in it. People would say, why would Assad do this? He's winning the war. Yeah, he is winning against these rebels, but they're not getting out fast enough for him, maybe. And he wants to send a message to other holdouts that this can happen to you if you don't cooperate. I mean, there's so many elements as to why people do bad things in a war that it blows my mind sometimes.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that. Tom, we have 30 seconds. Any other big things going on that we need to know about?
The hockey playoffs started last night. I'm very excited about that.
Okay. Who's favored to win?
Well, I'll tell you what. I live in Washington, D.C., and you talk about being a glum city. It's like no one thinks that Capitals can win this year because they always win the most games every year and get the most points and are out by the second round. I just say that because it's the playoffs for hockey and basketball. It's an exciting time. It's springtime in Washington. The cherry blossoms are blooming. So I'm going to leave you on a note of optimism that this will all work out.
Has the snow is gone?
It's gone.
That's great. Tom Scudieri, am I saying that right, Tom?
You are indeed.
Okay. Tom Scudieri with Talk Media News. Tom, thanks so much for dropping by today. Good talking with you.
Bye.
We'll be back. The next hour, Sam Cedar might drop by. He's lurking around the convention, but otherwise it's wide open for your calls.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Travis Lupik's book, Fighting for Space, how a group of drug users transformed one city's struggle with addiction. This is from the introduction. In a beat-up old hotel, Mark Townsend watched one of his tenants, a woman named Mary Jack, crawl up the stairs, so crippled by the symptoms of withdrawal that she couldn't lift her body to walk. It was 1992, Townsend recalls, and doctors required a thorough examination and patient history before they would prescribe methadone to someone addicted to drugs. Often that took several days. How can we make this woman's life bearable, he remembers thinking. The rules were wrong, Townsend decided. He found a doctor who put Mary on methadone immediately. They broke the law. That still didn't solve Mary's addiction to heroin. She would struggle with that for many years, but they addressed her immediate pain and made her well enough to fight another day. Like Townsend, activists, healthcare workers, and some politicians in cities across America are realizing that they will have to break and rewrite the rules on how society addresses addiction. The continent is in the grips of an overdose epidemic. In 2016, there were an estimated 64,000 fatal drug overdoses across the United States, up from fewer than 15,000 20 years earlier. Roughly 75% of 2016 deaths were attributed to heroin and similar drugs like OxyContin and fentanyl. For people under the age of 50, an overdose associated with an opioid is now the #1 cause of death in the United States. Heroin has reached the middle class and suburban America. At the same time, public opinion is turning against the war on drugs. Many policymakers are beginning to look at addiction as a healthcare issue as opposed to one for the criminal justice system. One Canadian city has seen this sort of crisis before. In response, a grassroots group of drug addicts waged a political street fight for 2 decades to transform how Vancouver treats its most marginalized citizens. Beginning in the early 1990s, activists pushed the city to adopt a 4-pillars approach to addiction. Authorities would continue with the pillars of prevention, treatment, and enforcement, but also deploy a series of complementary programs described as harm reduction. The city defined it like this: the principles of harm reduction require that we do no harm to those suffering from substance addiction, and that we focus on the harm caused by problematic substance use rather than substance use per se. In Vancouver, the municipal government accepted that it could not immediately help every addict stop using drugs. Therefore, for those people who fail to get clean or who are simply not ready for that step, it would attempt to make drug use less harmful. Inherent in harm reduction is an understanding that it is not necessarily the drugs themselves that do the most damage to the users. The law and systems of prohibition, which make drug procurement and possession illegal, are what hurt the people the most. When a person addicted to cocaine injects with a dirty needle, it's not the cocaine that poses a risk of infectious disease, it's the syringe. So why not make a clean needle available? Yes, the risk of overdose remains, as does the much larger issue of addiction itself, but the potential harm of an infectious disease is removed. When someone uses heroin in an alley, hurriedly injecting for fear of police, it's not the drug that causes them to rush and miscalculate their dose, possibly leading to an overdose. It's their fear of persecution. If they were offered an injection site where they could take their time and use under the observation of healthcare professionals, the risks would be reduced. Again, the addiction remains, but if they overdose at an injection site and a nurse is there to monitor them, they live to make another attempt at long-term treatment. Harm reduction strategies are about keeping people alive and as healthy as possible. excuse me, until they can arrive at a place in their lives where treatment or abstinence works for them. Today, there are dozens of cities across North America at the point where Vancouver was in the 1990s. Toledo, Miami, and San Francisco, for example, have sprouted activist groups that are working with healthcare professionals to slowly warm public opinion to this issue. 90% of new heroin users are white. A rising number are middle class or wealthy, a U.S. official told Frontline on PBS in 2016. Quote, "It's been true throughout American history that when drugs penetrated into the middle class, the white middle class, politicians panic much more than they do when the drugs are concentrated in poor neighborhoods. It's not fair and it's not right, but that is the kind of country we are living in." Jurisdictions across the United States are looking to Vancouver's example with increasing interest. One of the founders of Vancouver's harm reduction movement, Mark Townsend, spent April 2016 in New York helping that city expand needle exchange programs. In October 2016, a delegation from Seattle visited North America's, excuse me, visited North America's first supervised injection facility, Insight, in Vancouver. In early 2017, former BC coroner and Mayor Larry Campbell was in Sacramento helping lawmakers draft notices that would allow for the establishment of supervised injection facilities in California. Interest in Vancouver's model has grown with the increasing severity of America's opioid problem. This book, Fighting for Space, is about people who have slipped through the cracks. It's about those who have suffered the consequences of addiction and prohibition and who did not have family or friends to help them get back up. It's about those who, for a myriad of reasons, failed with treatment and rehabilitation. It tells their stories and explains harm reduction for communities that are struggling with overflowing jails, crimes fueled by desperation, and people left to die in the streets. Fighting for Space by Travis Lupick. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back from Las Vegas from the Mass Torts Made Perfect conference, Mike Papantonio's gig here in Vegas. We're having a fine old time. And let's pick up some of your phone calls. JC in San Francisco. Hey, JC, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I have an example for the gentleman, John, who had a skepticism about the trade deficit we were talking to a little while ago. And back in 1989, the Bay Area had a big earthquake, and it broke the Bay Bridge, our biggest transportation corridor. And we spent about 10 or 15 years just deliberating over how to rebuild it, who was going to get the contracts and all that stuff. So Caltrans settled, the transportation company settled on a Shanghai, China business to build the new struts for the new bridge replacement. And they said that they saved money by buying it from China. And by the time everything was brought over on special barges and shipped underneath the Golden Gate and such, they figured out, and this is before the final piers were sunk and everything, that they'd already spent more money buying from China than in reality it was a wash, essentially. But now the installation of all this stuff is proving problematic because the bolts and such are all, suspect of not being installed properly or not having the proper metallurgic resistance to the salt water and the air and stuff like that. Anyway, I was been listening to you for years since you replaced Al Franken, and I watched this evolve, and I thought, okay, maybe if China's really got that great a deal, but it before they'd even reopened the new section of the bridge, they already knew that they could have built it in California for the same price or less, and dealt with people right here rather than have it built in China. And then on a
so how did China get the contract?
Because they underbid all the American contractors and Canadian contractors for the steel.
And they lied in their bid?
No, they just underbid, and the bid it was subsidized by the Chinese capitalist, Chinese, I think you call it communist capitalist controlled. Yeah, many years ago I heard you.
The Chinese dictatorship, let's call it.
Okay. Anyway, they underbid everyone else, but by the time everything was delivered and put in place, whatever monies might have been saved by California were no longer saved because they were spending more money getting everything situated and readjusting it and stuff. Whereas if they dealt with just a business right here in the state of California, they could have mitigated all these other issues that dealing with China.
Plus all, and my point, JC, was that all the economic benefit of buying a new Golden Gate Bridge, I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar project. If all of that money was spent in the United States, it would stimulate local economies. It would revive some local economies. It would give people jobs. It would strengthen housing values and actual values, not just prices. But instead, by sending that money to China, what we're doing is we're building the infrastructure of China, and we're giving them more U.S. dollars that they can use to buy our infrastructure, to buy our nation. And that's not a good thing.
Right.
Back to you, JC.
Well, thanks for taking my call, Tom. Talk to you soon.
Sure. Good talking with you. Thanks a lot for the call. Rob in Mountain Iron, Minnesota. Hey, Rob, what's up? You want to talk about Scott Pruitt? Rob? Okay, Rob, you need to call back and listen to your phone instead of your TV. Earl in Vacaville, California. Hey, Earl, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's on your mind?
Good morning, Tom. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you, Earl?
Well, I'm as good as expected. What I want to say, basically, is it's partially in response to I believe his name was John, and the Trump supporter, and I'm thinking that whatever you call us, center left or progressives or Democrats or lefties or liberals, what we need to do is stop looking at this as a gentleman's argument. We need to look upon this as an actual cultural war that we're fighting with the far right. And essentially, in this country, there's no such thing as a moderate right or something like that. They're on the same team, basically.
Yeah.
And we need to look at it. We need to do strategy and tactics. We stop trying to be we're too damn rational. We need to come upon it as an actual military conflict. I'm not talking about having weapons and stuff, but take the Steve Bannon.
No, I agree with you, Earl. We need to start bringing a chainsaw to a knife fight.
Exactly. That's my point. That's my point. And we need to get someone, someone like me. The American left does not need. We need an angry. Excuse me for saying this. We need an angry young white man. That's what we need. Because I can talk at work. I talk myself blue. All right. I literally talk myself blue at work because 90% of the people I work with, they're hypnotized. They're stuck on Trump.
Yeah.
And
it's a scary thing, Earl. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. And I agree. I think that the left needs to be more strategic. It needs to be more aggressive. The problem is.
Go ahead.
Well, the problem is that on the right, there is this whole mythology around the noble lie. In fact, it has infected right-wing evangelism as well as right-wing politics, that it's okay to lie to people if the end result of their believing your lie will actually be a good thing for society. And the ideologues on the hard right, the libertarians, they actually believe, even though no country in the history of the world, no community in the history of the world has ever successfully been organized along libertarian lines, they believe that if they can just make that happen, it will be wonderful. It'll be paradise. The free market will solve all our problems. And therefore, lying to people to get to that point is actually a favor that you're doing to them. You're being generous to them. You're being considerate of them. And funding those lies to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, no problem. We'll support crazy Paul Ryan. We'll support his political career as long as he gives us our tax cuts, because our tax cuts are going to stimulate the economy and cause us to hire, another 50 people. And it's a real tragedy. And I don't know of any parallel construct on the left. Maybe out of I think that maybe some of the communist governments, whether it was the Soviet Union or maybe Cuba, there would have been some thought that we're going to achieve a paradise. But for the United States, the left has, to the best of my knowledge, has never taken that position that it's appropriate to lie to people for their own good. And
I feel that every time we talk, we bring up communism, and in my mind, I have never seen a nation that was a communist nation ever live up to Marxist values ever.
Right.
So
Marxist values can only be exercised in communities of fewer than 150 people. That's the only place where it works. Earl, I'm sorry, we're hitting the break here, but an excellent conversation, and thanks for calling and making the point that you did. It's one that needs to be made over and over and over again. Again, we're not willing to lie, and we don't have the billionaires. That's the challenge.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of your calls right after this break. And welcome back. Steve in Spokane, Washington. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind? Thanks for watching Free Speech on the Dish Network.
Welcome. Let's hope my internet phone lets me talk to you.
Okay.
I've been cut
Sounds good
off
so far.
Before. So I get the Tribal Tribune from the Colville Confederated Tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And in the March issue, it talks about that the Confederated Tribes have been fighting with a Canadian company, Teck Metals Limited, for a decade because they're dumping in Lake Roosevelt untreated waste. And the state of Washington has limits for fishermen not to eat more than one fish a month in that area. And then, unfortunately, they talked with the Department of Interior head, Zinke, as if, now he's a Trump nominated department head.
Interior Secretary, yeah. He's the head of the Department of Interior. He oversees all public lands in the United States.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that's actually going to help them. Also, in the same publication, they're working with WSU. It's a state university in Pullman, Washington. And they're seeing in the biodiversity of the salmon that their genetics are being limited, which they're thinking is going to make the salmon themselves more susceptible to diseases and other things.
Well, and also even ultimately to extinction.
Yeah.
When you lose biodiversity, you lose the resilience of a species.
Correct. But the Teck Metals Limited thing, the tribe tribe is not getting any outside help and assistance with this. And,
Can you post something about that over to our Facebook page?
Well, let's see. I'm not on Facebook. Is there another place I can?
You could tweet me a link.
Well, I know
Unless
in
you're
the
not on
tribal
Twitter.
news, there's the editor, Carrie Rosenbaum, and the phone number is 509.
No, don't give out our phone number on the air, please.
Okay.
That's something, that kind of information you can share with our call screener, but putting it on the air is not a good idea.
Okay, I'll
But
call them back.
so what you're suggesting then is you'd like to see this get more publicity. You'd like us to talk about it.
Right. It so far it's so limited that I don't think anybody's aware of this issue.
Steve, I'm going to put you on hold, and Steve's on line 2, Arthur. If Arthur can pick you up, he can get your information or get the information about it from you. I would like to look into that more. Thank you, Steve. We'll be back right after this. Stick around.
Fourth, they blame economic stresses on immigrants or racial or religious minorities and foment public bias or even violence against them, threaten mass deportations, registries of religious minorities, and the banning of refugees. Fifth, call anyone who opposes them an enemy and hit back hard at them, questioning their motives or their character. Fourth,
/Hartmann. That's FORHIMS.com/. Welcome back. Picking up your phone calls here. David in Woodland Hills, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind?
Thank you, Guru. Guy called before and said, how can Trump be Russia's lapdog and attack Russia at the same time? 30 seconds, I'll tell you. He's Don the Con, lying his butt off, playing both sides against the middle. That's what con men do. He has to.
He's done it his whole life.
Yes, he has to appease his Russian masters because of the money laundering and God knows what else. But he also has to appease our national security interests and the military-industrial complex and American public opinion. There could very well be a deal between Trump and Putin. You know, kill a few guys, lose a few planes. It's part of the con. Because remember, Tom, Putin's a con man too.
I can't dispute it, David. I think so much is going to come out when Mueller unloads the basket that he's been filling as he goes around looking at each one of these different people, members of the Trump crime family and people associated with them. It's going to be real interesting. And the thing that I'm most curious to see is the thing that you're speaking directly to, which is whether Donald Trump has, in his mind, whether Trump believes that he has been doing the bidding of Russia, or alternatively, whether Trump thinks that he's conning Russia in order to get a Trump hotel in Moscow. And, it may well be. It may well be.
That's what a con man does. You go back to The Godfather and the way the mafia works. They're telling one guy something and telling the other guy something else and hoping they don't find out and shoot him.
It makes sense. David, thanks for the call. Interesting. Gary in McDonough, Georgia. Hey, Gary, what's up?
Hey, Tom, listen, I want to tell you, I work with a conservative who I discovered your show, I'd say January of 2014, 2014, and he, and when Donald Trump announced that he was running for president, my conservative partner and I started. I introduced him to your show. We started listening. So he listened to you for basically a year and a half up to the election. He supported Bernie, but he's conservative, so his fallback, if he didn't get the nomination, he was always going with Hillary. But where I'm going with this is, yesterday he made a comment about how Donald Trump's presidency was going to go down in history. He's going to go down as one of the greatest presidents in history. I was flabbergasted. He's totally serious. I mean, because we don't talk politics much since the election, but I said, based off of what? He said the economy, the stock market. I stopped him. How much are you invested in the stock market? And I don't get. He said Donald Trump has gotten us out of the recession. I said, no, the recession, that was Obama that got us out of the recession. He said, no, the recession was just a couple of years ago. I told him, I mean, you're watching too much Fox News and listening to the power that they have and have these people convinced of an alternate reality. I just want progressives to understand that he can hear facts. I mean, he listened to your show. He enjoyed listening to your show for a year and a half up until the election, but their fallback in the primal instincts that they have, I mean, it's just flabbergasted. He said that Donald Trump will go down as one of the greatest presidents in his.
Well, here's the thing, Gary. I'm guessing if you were to ask him why, and you did, and he said the economy, but I'm guessing that there's probably a little more depth there. The position of the Republican Party since Nixon has been free trade. Nixon opened us to China and made us vulnerable to China. The position of the Democrats has been protectionism. Trump co-opted that in the campaign and said, I'm going to run as a protectionist. Donald Trump became Sherrod Brown, and which is kind of ironic because now Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, is running for re-election as a Democrat, saying, on the trade stuff, I support Donald Trump. And I would say I do too, to a certain extent, except I don't think he's doing this strategically. I think he's blundering around, but so you've got trade. Trump also campaigned on free health care for everybody, or inexpensive health care. He said, we're gonna get, and so Trump campaigned in many regards as a progressive, and somehow conservatives don't realize this. You might want to point that out to him, Gary. What do you think?
I have, the interesting thing, Tom, is when I do point him out, in fact, he looked it up shortly after he talked. He said, you're right, the recession was 2008. There are many occasions, countless, where we point out things and he sees what are facts. But it just strikes me, I've been working with him for 5 years. We didn't really get into a lot of political conversation, but, once we did, I mean, they just fall back to what they really know. I mean, he supported Bernie, but, he's a misogynist. He wasn't going to vote for Hillary. I get it. And so his fallback was going to be the guy that he originally. But I think it goes back to, further things that he doesn't want to admit. But, I bring out the fact that, Trump is a bigot and a racist, and his motivation is white grievance. Now he listened to those things. He disagreed, but, the facts are what,
You're right. Gary, I got to run here, but you're absolutely right. Thanks for the call. That's fascinating. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We're live from Las Vegas. We'll be back with more of your calls right after this. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Gar Alperovitz's book, What Then Must We Do? Gar is an economist, by the way, and this is from the introduction. I borrowed my title, What Then Must We Do, from Tolstoy and the profoundly disturbing 1886 book that he wrote once he began to dig below the surface of what was happening in late 19th century Russia, a time when the system was in decay, the aristocracy enjoyed extraordinary luxury, and the peasants endured lives of hunger and pain.
As a person of privilege, he began to understand something deeper about his time in history. Tolstoy wrote, "I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am very sorry for him and wish to ease his lot by all means possible, except by getting off his back." Most of us do not literally sit on men's backs, making them carry us. We do, however, often uneasily look the other way, satisfying ourselves with modest changes that reassure us that all is well, while millions are in despair. We've done the best we can do, we might say, given the realities. Still, many sense, as did Tolstoy, that to actually do something serious would require us to confront much deeper problems than we are commonly willing to do. What then must we do is not shouted in the streets, but it is a question that more and more Americans, young and old, liberal, radical, and conservative, are quietly beginning to ask themselves in much more penetrating ways. So let us begin. My starting point is the obvious fact that despite its great wealth, the United States faces today enormous difficulties, with no easily discernible political answers that even begin to offer strategic handholds on a truly democratic future. Elections occur and major fiscal debates ensue, but many of the most pressing problems facing ordinary citizens are only marginally affected, and in many cases in ways that increase burdens, not reduce them. The issue is not simply that our situation is worrisome, however. It is that there are growing reasons to believe that we in fact face systemic problems, not simply political ones. Systemic problems in the fundamental, not the superficial sense. In the pages ahead, I will suggest that our nation's truly critical problems are built into the very structure of the economic and political system. They are not something passing in the night that will go away even when we elect forward-looking thinkers and actively pressure them to move in a different direction. I won't load you down with statistics at this point. A couple of obvious reminders, however. Not only has the economy been stagnating for a long time, but for the average person and the average family, things have been bad for a very long time. Real wages for 80% of Americans' workers, for example, have not gone up more than a trivial amount for the last 3 decades. At the same time, income for the top 1% has jumped from nearly 10% of all income to roughly 20% of all income. Put another way, virtually all of the gains of the entire economic system have gone to the tiny, tiny group at the top for at least 3 decades. Worth pausing to think about that one. What's going on when virtually all the gains for the entire economic system go to the top? I'm not interested here in criticizing those at the top. The question is, we can do that later, the question is, what is going on with the system when this kind of thing happens and continues to happen in an ongoing way, year after year, decade after decade? Another reminder, almost 50 million Americans live in officially defined poverty. The rate is higher, not lower, than in the late 1960s, another disturbing trend marker. Moreover, if we use the measuring standard common throughout the advanced world, which considers the poverty level to be half the median income level, the number would be just under 70 million, and the rate would be almost 23% of all Americans living in poverty. That is to say nothing of steady increases in global warming and an unemployment rate that, if properly measured, is stuck in the range of roughly 15%. At the most superficial level, Washington, as the saying goes, is broken. Give or take an occasional gain in selected areas, the political system is simply incapable of dealing with the deeper challenges. It focuses on deficits, not answers. Long trends that don't change are a clear signal that it's not simply the modern period of partisan bickering and congressional stalemate that is causing the problems. The trends are moving steadily downward. We're moving steadily downward long before the Tea Party and the recent partisan foolishness, long before the Citizens United Supreme Court decision allowed corporations to put big money directly into politics, and long before many events that have heralded as tipping points one kind or another. Nor are people stupid. More and more have a sense that something different is going on, both with the economy and more fundamentally with democracy itself. A few more bits of information just as reminders again of something that we're all beginning to see. A mid-2011 poll found that roughly 80% of Americans believe their congressional representatives to be, quote, more interested in serving the needs of special interest groups than the people they represent, end quote. Another poll found that almost 4 out of 5 believe a few rich people in corporations have far too much power. And only 37% of Americans, much more than a third of the population, have confidence in the most solemn and august of American institutions, the Supreme Court. I'm going to dig much, much deeper into all of this, of course, but for now, let's leave it at this. When critical, long trends do not improve, when they steadily get worse year in and year out, it is clear that we face deeply rooted systemic problems, not simply political problems in the usual sense of the term. Moreover, as these polls suggest, people increasingly understand that something is really wrong. The question is, how do we deal with a systemic crisis, something built into the way the political economy works, rather than just a simple political or economic crisis? Garo Pavlovitz, what then must we do? "34 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you live from Las Vegas. Denise in Calumet, Michigan. Hey, Denise, what's up?
Hi, Tom. It's good to talk to you. I'm calling the Michiganders and people from all around the Great Lakes because there is a bill that is still in committee in Michigan. It's HB 5638. And what it is something that Nestle has been lobbying to get it easier for Nestle and companies like them to take the water out of all of the aquifers anywhere in the state of Michigan. And if that passes, they're going to start doing it in the UP. They're going to start draining the Superior. They're going to start, the farmers downstate already have dry wells, and they just want to give this water to Brazil and China and all these other places. So people need to call their state legislators and their state representatives.
They're pumping out water to put in giant tankers, or I always thought Nestle was pumping water out to sell bottled water to people.
Right, they're selling it now as bottled water, and that's what they want to do. But they want to sell billions of bottles to Brazil and China. They want to send it away. So this legislation is going to make it. Nestle pays $200 a year to do what they're doing now. They're stealing the water, and what they're making it is very easy for them to take more and from all over the whole state of Michigan. That's what this bill is about.
Insane. So how do people lobby against this, Denise, in Michigan?
They have to call their state legislators, their state representatives. I called...
Their state senators.
Yep, the state senators. And I've called several, and they're being very coy about it. They're pretending they don't know about it until I demand to tell them that this is actually HB 5638 and that I am aware of it and I want to know what they're doing about it, and then they start talking to me.
HB 5638. Okay, Denise, shout out to Michiganders. Get on the ball. Get active here. Denise, thank you very much for the call. Great to hear from you. Anthony in Utica, Michigan. From Michigan to Michigan. Hey, Anthony, what's on your mind?
Yes, Tom, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I know that you're interested in history and political science, as so am I, and I know your viewers and listeners. And I just read a book on Franklin D. Roosevelt, A Political Life. It's written by Robert Dallek. And because of the time constraint, I just want to point out a couple interesting points on FDR. The first one is Franklin D. Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie befriended one another shortly before the 1944 presidential election, and they discussed the serious possibility of changing the Democratic Party to a completely liberal party. In fact, Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to rename the Democratic Party the Liberal Party and let the Republicans become the conservatives. And the reason for it is he and Wendell Willkie were discussing this, and FDR was so fed up with the stubbornness and the intransigence from the Democratic Southern Party, the Democratic Southerners. They didn't want to support his New Deal, and he was getting all kinds of frustration and flack about that. And so that was interesting to hear about that. Unfortunately, he died, as we all know, before anything could take effect. And the second interesting thing is, do you know that Franklin D. Roosevelt suffered terribly from these angina attacks? During the campaign for 1944, he had one of his sons in the railroad car, and just before they were going to exit to make a speech, he went into a terrible convulsive angina attack, where he was actually shaking on the floor of the railroad car, and his son wanted to get help, and Roosevelt says no. He doesn't want to have people be aware of the nature of his problem, his heart problem. And many people, many people asked him, Mr. President, why don't you give up and seek a rest for your heart, for your poor health condition? He says no. He said there are frontline soldiers going through mud, bullets, and blood and muck, and he's going to serve this country just as they are on the front lines. Now, you know, reading something like that, it makes you wonder, my God, I'm 74 years old. I was only an infant. I was, 4 or 5 months when he was still alive. I wish that I would have been able to live and appreciate him as a leader, because he was such a wonderful, wonderful man. We are experiencing all this problem from the southern states. And, that reminds me of a famous quote by William Faulkner. He said, "The past is never dead. It isn't even past." And how true that is.
Yeah, I agree. And the real irony, and Anthony, thanks for the call, and thanks for sharing that with us. The real irony of Franklin Roosevelt and his angina, which I was familiar with, he ultimately died of a stroke, was that he smoked cigarettes. He smoked a lot of cigarettes. And it was tobacco that killed Franklin Roosevelt. And it just devastated his cardiovascular system, which is what smoking cigarettes does. And so he died a young man. I mean, he was in his 60s, as I recall, when he died. And it's such a tragedy. Brian in Dubuque, Iowa. Hey, Brian, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. How you doing?
Hey, Brian. Good. What's up?
I've smoked more marijuana than any other human being on earth ever, and I'm still
Are you saying that so we'll discount whatever you say that follows it?
No.
Okay.
What I wanted to say is, if I were president, I would stand up to Russia, and I would talk to the most knowledgeable people possible, and then probably make the decision regardless to take out Assad, occupy the government until we can put in a Syrian government that we feel we can have hope for. And that's all I wanted to say, Tom.
Well, let me ask you a question, Brian.
Go ahead.
We have I think it's the 6th Fleet. We've got a major naval presence in Qatar, the country just down the road from
my stepbrother was in there about a year ago or so. He's a lieutenant colonel in Special Forces.
Yeah, and Qatar has been, their country, as is the case with the UAE and is the case with Saudi Arabia. They've been accused of slavery practices, the way that they hold Filipinos and things. They do not, they're oppressive toward women by and large. Qatar isn't as bad as some of the other countries in the region, but they're, right across the board. And what would you say if the Russians came along and said, we just don't think it's right that the Qataris are behaving the way they are toward their citizens, that they prosecute people who speak out against the royal family, that democracy activists end up in prison. We think that Qatar should have a democracy. They should have elections. They should, instead of a kingdom, it should be a democracy. And so, we're going to take out the government. And we're still there with our military and your brother, Brian. What would you think?
What if Russia said that?
Yeah. Or what if France said that, for that matter?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I said, or what if France said that, for that matter? Although I'm using Russia because you're saying let's get into a conflict with Russia over Syria. And I'm saying, okay, what if Russia decided to get into a conflict with us over Qatar?
I would want to avoid a conflict with Russia, even if it weren't possible to do so, But
see, Russia and Syria is in the same position that we're in Qatar. That's their only naval base in the region. What are you going to do about that?
Or the Saudis?
The Russians. The Russians have the only Russian military and naval presence in that region is they've got a huge naval base and an Air Force base in Syria. And that's what they're trying to protect. It's not, I don't believe that it's like they're sitting around going, oh, Saddam,
Qatar?
No, they're not right next door. They're they're hundreds of miles apart, but my point was in the region, on the Gulf.
I would suggest that those are two different scenarios, but I guess it really hinges on whether you want to do anything about Assad or not. Not you personally, Tom, but metaphorically.
No, I get that. I get that, and or whether we want to do anything about ISIS, or whether we want to do anything about the oppressive government now in Myanmar.
Right, and
to what extent is it our job to keep the world safe for whatever we're trying to keep it safe for? We used to say we're trying to keep the world safe for American corporations.
I agree with what you're thinking, Tom. And there's a theory by very smart people who believe that we really would be better off doing nothing and then just ignoring people, groups like ISIS and whatever and all that stuff.
Well, no, I'd say stop doing stupid things. We wouldn't have ISIS if George Herbert Walker Bush didn't want to have a 100-day war in order to further his electoral chances in 1992. We would not have ISIS right now if his son, George W. Bush, hadn't told his biographer in 1999, Mickey Herskowitz, that if he became president, he was going to invade Iraq, and he wasn't going to make the mistake that his dad did of pulling out after only 100 days. He was going to stay there right through the election cycle so he could get the benefit of being a wartime president. We would not have ISIS right now if it wasn't for the actions of two Bush presidents. It's like we have to realize that when we reach out across the world and try to impose policy, particularly when it's done for these craven reasons, that there are huge consequences to us as well as everybody else. Brian, thank you for the call. I'm not taking a complete isolationist position. What I'm saying is, frankly, what Donald Trump said during the election: no more stupid wars. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
I mean, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and sometimes you need to pay attention to it. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Sharif in Independence, Missouri. Hey, Sharif, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
How are you doing?
I'm well. What's up?
Well, Tom.
Am I saying your name right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I was angry with you a couple weeks ago when he started talking about this imposing tariffs and this, that, and the other, and I was naive and not informed. And I didn't turn you off. I continued to listen, and the more I continued to listen to you, and the more you had people come on, and then the more I started listening and paying attention, I was like, oh, okay, well, now I'm there. I understand what he's saying. And then the teachers went out on strike. And so I'm looking at all these teachers and thousands of them, and I'm looking at them, and I'm like, okay, those teachers used to be under an umbrella of a union, and the teachers were.
Sharif, your phone just faded out. Can you repeat your last sentence? You may need to go stand by a window or something because you've just completely vanished. She's gone. Oh, I'm sorry. Sharif, call us back. We'll try to continue or finish the conversation. Rick in Weston, West Virginia. Hey, Rick, what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Tom? Smedley Butler, I've read some of his autobiographical stuff. I believe he
won War is a Racket is his main book. It's brilliant.
Right, right. But I believe he won the Medal of Honor as well.
Yes, he did. He was the most decorated Marine in the history of the United States at the time that he wrote that book.
Yeah, he did get the Medal of Honor, if memory serves me correct. What I'm saying is, it seems to me that now I'm an amateur student of history. It's interested me since elementary school. And it seems to me society as a whole, the world as a whole, just keeps on repeating the same mistakes and not really learning any lessons. I heard somebody talk earlier about it's time to stand up and resist. I agree totally. I was born in 1954. I had to go register for the draft. I remember summer '72 very well. I remember the public sentiment. War is a racket, and this idea of unrestrained capitalism, it appeals to some people's baser instincts. You have to have some kind of, I'm not talking religion or anything like that, I'm talking basic human dignity and morality. When people are ready to trade blood and bodies for profit, there's something wrong. I watched one night late about the world population consuming the world's resources is 7.5 times the rate that this planet can provide. My question is to you, how long can we continue on at this rate without finally just, as I believe Stephen Hawking said, we reach the tipping point and there is no return? I mean, how long?
Rick, we're already there.
All great empires.
Rick, forgive my interruption, but we're hitting the break here. We're already there. You're seeing resource wars. That's what the war in Syria is a resource war. Global warming pushed the desert 100 miles south in Syria and wiped out 1 million farmers. And they went into Damascus, and that's what's going on. It's already here.
Paychecks. You know, we knew that the first 2 paychecks that he received, that he supposedly donated them, but he said he was going to donate all his money.
Wait a second, Gigi, who's the he that you're talking about?
Donald Trump. Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the question is he keeping his paychecks?
He was not going to take a paycheck and that he was going to donate all his money, and we only heard about the first 2. But we haven't heard about the other 2. We're coming into, another year to where he's going to get 4 more paychecks and haven't heard anything.
Well, is the president paid quarterly? I thought as a federal employee he was paid every 2 weeks.
Oh, I thought it was quarterly. Then I must be wrong then.
I might be wrong. I mean, maybe there's some special weird way that they pay the president, but I think that he's a federal employee. His paycheck is cut by the same people who cut the paychecks for all federal employees, and I believe that federal employees are paid biweekly. I'm not one, and I've never been one, so I don't know for sure, but I believe that to be the case. And if he donated a couple of checks, Trump is famous for doing the thing that gets him attention, that's the flair, the symbolic gesture, but not having any substance. And so it wouldn't surprise, and he's such a money grubber, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he donated a couple 2-week paychecks, which are not inconsequential, $10,000, $20,000. But if he donated a couple of 2-week paychecks and then just kept all the rest, and who did he donate it to? Did he give it to the Trump Foundation? It's a nonprofit after all. I don't know the answer to that, but Gigi, it's a good question, and hopefully somebody's digging into this and we'll find out. Thanks for the call. Tom in Hudsonville, Michigan. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, I wondered why the Democratic Party and the candidates can't get a progressive, effective message like the Square Deal and New Deal and stick to something focused, because we're not going to change anything until Democrats get elected. But, you know, we are so ineffective in getting a message across. No bumper sticker that I've ever seen is on any bumpers that mean anything to me. But I wanted to ask you about that and why people like you and Robert Reich, I'm just saying the progressives, aren't running for, as candidates with clear progressive messages. We're all over the place, Tom. We will tackle every problem and give every solution, but nothing focused.
I think that a good bumper sticker, as it were, for Democrats would be health care for all, education for all, a thriving economy, and a clean environment. That's four things I realize.
And a living wage for all.
Well, that becomes part of the thriving economy. You need to get the word economy in there someplace. So then, when somebody says, "Well, what do you mean by that?" you can say, "Well, we want to raise the minimum wage. We want to increase unionization. We want to, those kinds of things." But I think a lot of Democrats are talking like that. That's the better deal, which I think is an unfortunate choice of words, but it's what the DNC has chosen to do. It's not catching much traction, but the reason that the Republicans are able to beat one single drum all the time is because they've got a bunch of billionaires who are focusing that for them, who are running the ads, who are doing the focus groups, who are basically holding their feet to the fire. There's no equivalent on the Democratic side. There's no interest group out there that's saying to the Democrats, "You got to do this way." So it does get scattered. The reason, by the way, Tom, that I'm not running for political office is I think I do a pretty good job of a talk show and writing articles and books, and I really believe in the old adage, do what you do well. Know what you do well and do that. Tom, thanks a lot for the call. Rodney in Whiting, Indiana, or Whiting, Indiana? Which is it, Rodney?
It's Whiting.
Whiting. We got about a minute and a half here, Rodney, till the end of the show. So what's up?
Okay, I just want to say our government is run by a mob, and it's very frustrating to me to hear people call in and talk about the military-industrial complex in Trump and the recession in Trump. And, Wesley Clark went on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! And said about what was going to be planned. Syria, all these countries that they were planning to go into. And it was already decided after 9/11 to go into Iraq, and he didn't know why. He said, because there's nothing else we can do. So, it's very hard for me to not say it's both sides of the aisle and nothing's going to get done because one party just hands over and takes over from the previous. They just, Obama didn't jail any bankers. We never got a public option. Things just don't move, and it's just, I say, like you said, it's already there. We're already past that point. And
we've passed the tipping point. Yeah, we need to step up and we need to do remediation right now, which boils down to the way I've been closing this show for 14 or 15 years now, which is that it's not enough to just sit on our hands. It's not enough to complain. It's not enough to share a meme on Facebook or tweet something. We need to get actively involved. Share progressive media with people, help wake them up, and then make sure you're registered to vote and get out there and get active. Because if we don't, we're going down the tubes. This whole planet is going down the tubes. So get out there, get active, tag You're It. We'll see you tomorrow again live from Las Vegas.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.